On the 5th of April 1531, a cook named Richard Rouse was dragged through the streets of London to Smithfield, where a crowd had gathered around an enormous iron cauldron filled with water, already bubbling over a roaring fire. Rouse had been convicted of slipping poison into a pot of porridge meant for the household of John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester. 2 people died, a gentleman named Burnet Curwen and a poor beggar woman called Alice Trippitt, who had simply been in the wrong kitchen at the wrong time, hoping for a free meal. Henry VIII took the crime so personally that he pushed a brand new law through Parliament, the Poisoning Act of 1530, which made killing by poison an act of high treason punishable not by hanging, not by beheading, but by boiling alive. And so Richard Rouse was lowered into that cauldron on a chain, pulled up and down by a gibbet dipped again and again into the scalding water, while the crowd watched and the Grey Friars Chronicle dutifully recorded the whole thing for posterity. Historians still argue whether Rouse was a genuine assassin hired by enemies of Bishop Fisher, perhaps even agents sympathetic to Anne Boleyn's faction, or merely a spectacularly stupid man who trusted a stranger handing out mysterious white powder and thought it would make a funny prank. Either way, Henry's message was unmistakable. You do not tamper with the king's food. You do not tamper with anyone's food. And if you do, you will cook longer than the pottage ever did. Now that story might seem like a strange way to begin a bedtime episode, but it tells you everything you need to know about tonight's subject. We're going to spend the next couple of hours exploring what it was actually like to sit at Henry VIII's royal table in the year 1546. The last full year of his reign, when the king was enormous, paranoid, in constant pain, and surrounded by courtiers who smiled through their teeth while silently calculating whether they would survive until dessert. This is not the sanitized Renaissance fair version of Tudor dining. This is the real thing. The politics, the pageantry, the sweating cooks, the poisoned gravy, and the mind-boggling quantities of roasted swan. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. There is no obligation, no Tudor law compelling you, and I can promise you will not be boiled in a cauldron if you choose to scroll past. Though I appreciate the ones who stick around. If you are watching this, drop your location and your local time in the comments. I always love seeing where you all are, whether it is 2 in the morning in Manila or just past sunset in São Paulo. It makes this feel like a proper gathering, which is fitting, because tonight we're attending the most dangerous dinner party in English history. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. Get your blankets sorted, find that perfect position, you know the one, and let your breathing slow down just a little. We are heading back nearly 500 years, to a London that smells of wood smoke and river mud and roasting meat, to a palace where every smile hides a dagger and every dish hides a prayer. You're about to become a minor courtier in the household of King Henry VIII, and your first meal at the royal table is about to begin. Whether you survive it, well, that depends entirely on how well you play the game. Let us start with how you got here in the first place. It is the autumn of 1546. You're a younger son of a middling gentry, family somewhere in the south of England, comfortable enough to own land, but not wealthy enough to sit at home and ignore the court. Your father pulled some strings, called in a favour owed by a cousin who serves in the household of the Lord Chamberlain, and after months of quiet negotiation, you have been granted a minor position in the royal household. You're nobody important. You do not have a title. You do not have wealth. What you have is proximity. And in Tudor England, proximity to the king is the most valuable currency there is. More valuable than gold, more valuable than land, more valuable even than a pound of saffron, which in 1546 costs roughly a month's wages for a skilled craftsman. You are here because being near Henry means opportunities, grants, offices, marriages, advancement, and because being far from Henry means obscurity, poverty, and irrelevance. Of course, being near Henry also means danger, because this particular king has a habit of destroying the people closest to him, but you try not to think about that as your horse carries you along the muddy road toward London, past fields stubbled with the remains of the autumn harvest, under a sky the colour of pewter. You can smell the city before you see it. The Thames carries its own particular perfume, a blend of fish guts, tannery waste, human sewage, and the faint sweetness of brewing ale that drifts from the dozens of brewhouses lining the south bank. London in 1546 is home to roughly 100,000 souls, which makes it enormous by the standards of the time. though you could fit the entire population into a modern football stadium with room to spare. The streets are narrow, unpaved in most places, and shared equally by humans, horses, pigs, and rats. A quirky little detail that most people do not know. The city actually employed official pig catchers whose sole job was to round up stray swine wandering through the lanes. Because loose pigs had a troublesome habit of knocking over market stalls and, on at least one recorded occasion, biting a child badly enough to require a barber surgeon. You keep your horse to the centre of the road, away from the upper story windows, because chamber pots are emptied from above with only a perfunctory shout of warning. And arriving at court covered in someone else's breakfast would not make the impression you are hoping for. Your destination is the Palace of Whitehall, which in 1546 is the principal royal residence and the largest palace in Europe. It sprawls across 23 acres along the Thames, a chaotic jumble of buildings, courtyards, gardens, tennis courts, a cockfighting pit, a tilt yard for jousting, and enough corridors to lose yourself in for an afternoon. Henry acquired it from Cardinal Wolsey back in 1530, the same way he acquired most things, by making it clear that refusal was not really an option. Wolsey, who had built the place as York Place when he was Lord Chancellor, handed it over and died shortly afterward, which was a pattern that tended to repeat itself around Henry. The palace has no single architectural plan. It has been expanded, modified, patched, and extended so many times that it resembles less a royal residence and more a small, very confused city. There are over 1,500 rooms. Let that settle for a moment. 1,500 rooms connected by passageways that twist and turn and sometimes dead end into walls that were not there last year, because Henry keeps commissioning new building projects. The whole place is heated by enormous fireplaces, lit by thousands of candles, and staffed by a household of roughly 800 people, all of whom have specific jobs, specific ranks, and specific places where they are and are not allowed to go. And this is the first thing you learn about life at Henry's court. Everything is about access. The palace operates on a system of increasingly restricted zones, like concentric circles around the king, and your rank determines how far inward you can penetrate. The outermost areas, the courtyards, the service buildings, the stables, are open to nearly anyone with legitimate business. Delivery carts rattle in and out all day. Merchants bring wine from Bordeaux, fish from Billingsgate, spices from the docks at Queenhithe. Messengers arrive on lathered horses. Petitioners loiter in doorways, hoping to catch the eye of someone important enough to carry their grievance a step further inside. This is the noisy, churning periphery of power, and it smells of horse dung and ambition in roughly equal measure. Move one layer deeper, and you reach the Great Hall, which is the social centre of the household. If Whitehall had one at the scale of Hampton Court, and it essentially did, then this is a vast, high-ceilinged chamber with a hammer-beam roof and tapestries covering the stone walls for warmth as much as decoration. About 600 of the lower-ranking household members eat here in 2 daily sittings, their meals served on wooden trenchers at long trestle tables arranged in rows. The noise during mealtime is considerable. Imagine a school canteen, but with more ale and fewer vegetables, and where everyone is wearing wool and linen and the lighting comes exclusively from candles and whatever grey daylight filters through the windows. This is where you will take your meals, at least for now. Your seat assignment is not random. It is determined by your rank, and it is determined precisely. You do not simply walk in and sit wherever you like. That kind of casual self-seating would cause a scandal roughly equivalent to showing up at Buckingham Palace in your pyjamas. The Eltham Ordinances of 1526, a massive, detailed set of household rules drawn up by Cardinal Wolsey, specify exactly who sits where, what they eat, how much ale they receive, and even how many candles their table gets. Your place is below the salt, which means you're seated in the lower portion of the hall, away from the high table, on the wrong side of the great ceremonial salt cellar that sits in the middle of the room like a gleaming silver judgment. The salt cellar itself is worth pausing over, because in Tudor England, salt is not just a condiment. It is a marker of status so important that your entire social position can be read from your relationship to it. The Great Salt, as it is called, is an ornate, towering vessel, often shaped like a ship or a castle, made of silver or silver gilt, and placed at the centre of the high table. Everyone seated above the salt are closer to the head of the table. Closer to where the lord, or in this case the king's representatives, sit, is of higher rank. Everyone below it, which includes you, is of lower rank. This is not subtle. This is not a gentle hint. This is a physical, visible, three-dimensional announcement of your place in the world, and it sits right there on the table between you and the people who matter. You will eat the same bread. Well, not exactly the same bread, actually, because the people above the salt get manchet, which is fine white bread made from sifted flour, while you get cheat bread, which is coarser, darker, and made from flour that has not been so thoroughly refined. But the point stands. You are here. You are below the salt, and everyone knows it. Beyond the great hall lies the great watching chamber, and this is where the invisible barrier becomes very real. The yeomen of the guard, Henry's personal bodyguard unit, established by his father Henry VII, stand watch at the entrance, and they do not let just anyone through. Only courtiers of sufficient rank, members of the Privy Chamber, visiting ambassadors, and specifically summoned individuals are permitted to pass. This is the first of the King's state apartments, and entering it means you have crossed from the merely communal into the genuinely political. The Great Watching Chamber is where higher-ranking courtiers dine, where visiting dignitaries are received, and where the Sunday and feast day liturgical processions pass through on their way to the Chapel Royal. The tapestries here are finer. The food is better. The wine is real Gascon claret, not the watered ale you get down in the Great Hall, and the conversation is more dangerous because in this room, the things you say might actually reach the King's ears. Beyond the watching chamber lies the presence chamber, and beyond that the Privy Chamber and the King's private apartments. You will likely never see these rooms. The Privy Chamber is staffed by the Gentlemen of the Privy Chamber, a small elite group of men who attend to the King's most personal needs, dressing him, bathing him, sleeping in his bedchamber on a pallet at the foot of his bed. These are the men who see Henry without his public mask, who know when his leg ulcers are seeping, who hear him groan in the night from pain. They are among the most powerful men in England, not because of their titles, but because of their access. In 1546, the chief gentleman of the Privy Chamber is Sir Anthony Denny, a quiet, efficient Protestant who has the King's ear and knows exactly how to use it. Historians still argue whether Denny's influence on Henry's religious policies was calculated, political manoeuvring, or simply the natural consequence of being the last person the King spoke to before falling asleep each night. Either way, Denny is a man you want to befriend and absolutely do not want to cross, but you are nowhere near the Privy Chamber. You are in the Great Hall eating cheat bread, drinking your allotted 2 pints of ale, and trying to figure out which fork of this enormous, bewildering palace leads to the privy and which leads to the wine cellar. The distinction matters more than you might think, because getting lost in Whitehall is not just embarrassing. It might lead you into a restricted area, which could raise questions about your intentions, which in 1546 is the kind of question that can end with your head on a spike above London Bridge. A small historical detail that might amuse you. The Eltham Ordinances also attempted to regulate the number of dogs allowed at court, because the halls had become overrun with pets. Courtiers brought their dogs everywhere, to meals, to chapel, to council meetings, and the animals fought under the tables, stole food from trenches, and left presents on the rushes that covered the floors. Wolsey's rules tried to limit dogs to specific areas, but surviving accounts suggest this was about as effective as trying to ban gossip. The dogs stayed. They always stayed. Henry himself kept greyhounds and spaniels, and they were probably better fed than half the servants in the outer household. Now that you have some sense of the palace's geography, let us descend into the place where all the magic and all the misery happens, the kitchens. Henry VIII's kitchen complex is not a single room. It is, in the fullest sense, a separate world. At Hampton Court, which Henry uses interchangeably with Whitehall, and which has the best preserved kitchens from this era, the complex spans 55 interconnected rooms covering roughly 3,000 square feet. There are separate rooms for roasting, boiling, baking, pastry making, sauce preparation, spice storage, butchering, fish preparation and confectionery. There is a scullery for washing. There is a pantry for bread. There is a cellar for wine and another for ale. There is a room just for making wafers. There is, in short, a room for everything. Because feeding this many people, this many meals, requires an operation with the logistical complexity of a small military campaign. 200 people work here. Not 20, not 50, 200. Cooks, undercooks, scullions, turnspits, porters, grooms, sergeants, pages, and the 3 master cooks who preside over everything with the authority of generals. and the temperament of bears woken too early from hibernation. The hierarchy is strict. At the top sits the clerk of the kitchen, who manages the accounts, orders supplies, and ensures that the household budget, which is enormous, does not spiral completely out of control. Beneath him, the sergeant of each kitchen department runs his domain with an iron hand and a wooden spoon, directing the yeoman cooks who do the actual skilled labour, while the grooms handle preparation and the pages do the running and fetching and general getting shouted at. That is the universal experience of being young and low-ranking in any kitchen in any century. You enter the kitchen complex through a service corridor, and the first thing that hits you is the heat. It strikes your face like opening an oven door, because that is essentially what you have done. 6 enormous fireplaces blaze along the walls of the great kitchen, each one large enough to stand inside, each one consuming logs the size of a man's thigh. The fuel consumption is staggering. These kitchens burn through approximately 1.3 million logs per year, 6 tons of wood per day, and the heat radiating from those fires turns the room into something a visiting Spanish ambassador once described as genuinely hellish. The air shimmers. The stone walls are black with soot. The cooks closest to the fires work stripped to the waist, their skin glistening with sweat, their faces flush the colour of the coals they tend. And the noise, metal on metal shouted orders, the sizzle and spit of fat dripping into flames, the thud of cleavers on butcher blocks, the rumble of cauldrons at a rolling boil. This is not a peaceful place. This is industrial-scale food production, Tudor style, and it runs from before dawn until well after dark 7 days a week, 365 days a year. The centrepiece of the great kitchen is the roasting area, where enormous joints of beef, whole sides of mutton, and entire deer carcasses are mounted on iron spits and turned slowly before the fires. The spits are turned by hand, by boys, usually called turnspit boys, who sit in alcoves beside the fireplace and rotate the handles hour after hour in the sweltering heat. It is one of the worst jobs in the kitchen, perhaps one of the worst jobs in England, and it is performed by the youngest and most expendable members of the staff. A quirky detail. In some great houses, turnspit dogs, small, long-bodied dogs bred specifically for the purpose, were placed in wheel cages beside the fire and forced to run in circles to turn the spits, like hamsters on a wheel. Except the hamster was a dog and the wheel was next to a bonfire, and the stakes were whether or not the king's venison was properly browned. Henry's kitchens at Hampton Court appear to have primarily used human turnspit boys rather than dogs, but the practice was common enough elsewhere that the turnspit dog became a recognised breed, now extinct. Because once mechanical jacks replaced them in the 18th century, nobody needed a short-legged, slightly depressed-looking dog anymore, and the breed quietly vanished from history. Historians still argue whether turnspit dogs were treated as working animals with genuine utility, or as a curiosity that amused visiting guests more than it actually contributed to the cooking process. The truth is probably a bit of both. Beyond the roasting area you find the boiling house, where great copper cauldrons bubble with stews, pottages and broths. The pastry kitchen, where the bakers produce the ornate architectural pies that are a centrepiece of Tudor dining. Pies with crusts so elaborately decorated they look like miniature cathedrals, filled with layers of different meats separated by forcemeat and spiced fruit. The confectionery, where sugar is worked into extraordinary shapes by specialists whose skills are closer to sculpture than cooking. And everywhere, the constant traffic of servants carrying ingredients in, carrying dishes out, hauling water from the well, dragging sacks of flour from the storerooms, rolling barrels of ale from the brew house, and generally performing the 10,000 small acts of labour that keep this enormous machine grinding forward. The smells layer on top of each other until they become a single, overwhelming olfactory event. Roasting meat is the base note, rich, fatty, with the sweet char of dripping. Over that lies the sharp tang of vinegar from the sauces being prepared in copper pans. Then the yeasty warmth of bread baking in the adjacent bakehouse. The pungent bite of onions and garlic being chopped by a row of grooms who are all, without exception, weeping openly, because onions do not care about your dignity. And underneath everything, the slightly sour note of the rushes on the floor, which are changed regularly but never quite often enough, mixed with the smell of spilled ale and animal fat, and the general human funk of 200 people working in close quarters without the benefit of modern deodorant. You will get used to it, Everyone does. But right now, in this moment, you're standing in the doorway with your mouth slightly open, wondering how any of this produces the elegant dishes you have heard about from the returning courtiers. The answer to that question lies with the three master cooks, who are the undisputed rulers of this culinary kingdom. In 1546, these are men of genuine importance. Not nobles, certainly, not anyone who would be invited to dine above the salt, but skilled professionals who command respect, earn decent wages, and possess knowledge that is genuinely irreplaceable. The master cook for the king oversees everything that touches the royal palate. He plans the menus, supervises the preparation, tastes the dishes before they leave the kitchen, a job that carries both honour and a very literal risk to his health, and ensures that every plate that arrives at the king's table is presented with the precision of a jeweller setting stones. He is, in many ways, the most important person at the dinner who will never actually be seen at the dinner, which is a particular kind of Tudor irony that nobody has time to appreciate. The hierarchy beneath the master cook is rigid and enforced with a kind of discipline that would make a military quartermaster nod approvingly. Each department, roasting, boiling, pastry, sauce, confectionery, has its own sergeant, and each sergeant has his team of yeoman cooks, grooms and pages. The yeoman cooks are the skilled tradesmen, men who have spent years learning their craft through apprenticeship, and who can butcher a deer, roast a haunch to perfection, and construct a pie crust that holds its shape through hours of cooking without cracking. The grooms do the preparation work, peeling, chopping, stirring, hauling, and the pages do whatever nobody else wants to do, which is most things. Promotion through this hierarchy is slow, based on skill and seniority and the occasional strategic death of someone above you. A groom might spend a decade before becoming a yeoman cook. A yeoman might never become a sergeant. And the position of master cook is so rarefied that when one dies or retires, the appointment of his successor involves discussions at the level of the Lord Steward himself, because whoever controls what the king eats controls, in a very real sense, the king's life. There is a detail about these kitchens that surprises most people when they learn it. The cooks are overwhelmingly male. Women are largely absent from the great kitchens, except in a few specific roles like the dairy and the laundry. This is not because Tudor society thought women could not cook. Obviously women prepared most meals in ordinary households, but because the royal kitchen was considered a place of such importance, such proximity to the king's person through his food, that it operated under quasi-military rules that excluded women as a matter of protocol. The exception was the confectionery, where women occasionally worked alongside men to produce the elaborate sugar sculptures, but even there, the senior positions were held by men. Historians still argue whether this exclusion was purely about tradition and protocol, or whether it reflected deeper anxieties about women's supposed susceptibility to being recruited as poisoners, a fear that seems absurd until you remember Richard Roos and the cauldron at Smithfield. The day in the kitchen begins well before dawn. By 4 a.m, the fires are being stoked, the bread ovens are being heated, and the first deliveries of the day are arriving at the service entrance. Fresh fish from the Thames and from Billingsgate Market, meat from the royal slaughterhouses, vegetables, though far fewer than you might expect because the Tudor upper-class diet is spectacularly, almost heroically meat-heavy, dairy from the palace farms, and the spices, those precious, astronomically expensive spices, which are kept under lock and key in the spicery and dispensed by the clerk. Comptroller with the care of a pharmacist measuring out medicine. A pound of pepper in 1546 costs more than 2 days' wages for a skilled London craftsman. A pound of cloves costs 5 days' wages, and a pound of saffron, the most expensive spice of all, worth literally more than its weight in silver, costs a full month's wages. These are not condiments, these are investments. And the clerk comptroller knows the exact quantity of each spice in his inventory, because discrepancies lead to accusations of theft, and accusations of theft lead to dismissal, disgrace, and potentially worse. By 6 a.m, the kitchens are in full roar. The turnspit boys are at their stations, slowly rotating the great spits laden with beef and mutton and pork. The boiling house has its cauldrons going, great iron pots of pottage, the thick, savoury stew that is the staple food of the lower household, flavoured with whatever meat and vegetables are available, and thickened with oatmeal or bread. The pastry kitchen is producing the day's pies and tarts, the crusts rolled and shaped and filled with everything from venison to fruit to hard-boiled eggs, embedded in force-meat like geological strata. The bakehouse next door is turning out hundreds of loaves, fine white manchet for the upper household and coarser cheat bread for everyone else. And the brewery, which operates on a completely different schedule but never really stops, is producing the approximately 600 gallons of ale and beer that the household will consume today. 600 gallons. Every day. For a household of roughly 800 people, that works out to about 6 pints per person per day, which sounds alarming until you realise that Tudor ale is generally weaker than modern beer, and that drinking water in 16th century London is an act of either bravery or suicide. Because the Thames is essentially an open sewer and the wells are not much better, ale is not a luxury, it is a public health measure. A small, delightful fact. The brewing operations at Hampton Court were divided between an ale brewer and a beer brewer, because ale and beer were considered completely different beverages. Ale was the traditional English drink, made without hops, sweet, and relatively quick to spoil. Beer was the continental innovation, brewed with hops, which gave it a bitter flavour and a much longer shelf life. Henry himself was reportedly fond of both, but a household document from 1530 specifically instructs the ale brewer to put neither hops nor brimstone in the ale pipes, the enormous 120-gallon casks, suggesting that the distinction between ale and beer was taken extremely seriously and that the ale brewer had perhaps been caught trying to sneak in some hops to extend his product's shelf life. The beer brewer, a man named John Pope, had his own separate domain and his own separate supply chain, and the two operations ran in parallel, like rival embassies representing different countries of fermented grain. Let us talk about what actually ends up on the plates, or rather on the trenchers, because plates as you know them are not quite the standard here. The food served at Henry's court is a monument to excess, a celebration of protein so enthusiastic that it makes a modern steakhouse look like a salad bar. The king himself is offered a minimum of 13 freshly cooked dishes at every meal. Not 13 courses, mind you, but 13 separate dishes presented simultaneously, arranged on the table for him to sample as he pleases. A surviving document listing the king's daily diet includes cheat bread, manchet, ale, wine, flesh for pottage, Chinese of beef, venison, pastels of deer, carps of young veal and custard, and this is just the standard daily fare, not a feast day spread. On feast days, the numbers multiply dramatically. Meat dominates everything: beef, mutton, pork, veal, venison, rabbit, and an entire aviary of birds. Capons, chickens, pigeons, larks, plovers, herons, bitterns, and the showpiece birds that make Tudor banquets the spectacles they are. Swan and peacock. Swan is a dish reserved exclusively for royalty and the highest nobility. In Tudor England, all mute swans on open water belong to the crown, and eating one without specific permission from the king is a criminal offence. The bird is roasted whole and then, in a display of culinary theatre that borders on insanity, carefully recovered in its own skin and feathers, and presented at the table looking as lifelike as possible, sometimes with gold leaf applied to its feathers using egg white as adhesive. The effect is meant to be magnificent. The taste, by most historical accounts, is not. Swan is tough, oily, and strongly flavoured in a way that even generous amounts of spice cannot entirely disguise. But nobody eats swan for the flavour. You eat swan because you can, and because everyone watching you eat it knows exactly what it means about your status. Peacock is even more theatrical. The servants carefully skin the bird before cooking, preserving the entire plumage intact. The naked bird is roasted, spiced, and then painstakingly reassembled inside its own feathered skin, the tail fanned out behind it, the head propped up on a wire, the beak and claws sometimes gilded with real gold. And here is the part that never fails to astonish people. Ambitious cooks placed burning camphor or alcohol-soaked cotton inside the peacock's beak so that when the dish was carried to the table in torchlit procession, the bird appeared to be breathing fire. A dead, roasted, reassembled peacock glittering with gold, marching into the great hall wreathed in actual flames, carried aloft by sweating servants who were desperately hoping the fire would not spread to the feathers. If that is not the most Tudor thing you've ever heard, I do not know what is. But the truly exotic dishes push even further into territory that might make a modern diner pause. Porpoise appears on Tudor menus with some regularity, classified as a fish for the purposes of Lenten dietary restrictions, which tells you everything you need to know about Tudor logic regarding marine mammals. Conger eel, lamprey, pike and carp are standard offerings for fish days, when the consumption of meat from warm-blooded animals is forbidden by the church. And then there are the pies, those extraordinary Baroque constructions that are the signature of Tudor high cuisine. A proper Tudor pie is not a humble pastry with some filling, it is an architectural achievement. The crust, called a coffin, is built thick and sturdy enough to stand unsupported, often in elaborate shapes, castles, ships, crowns, and filled with multiple layers of different meats, separated by forcemeat stuffing, seasoned with pepper, ginger, and cloves, and sometimes containing hard-boiled eggs or dried fruits for additional texture and visual impact when the pie is cut open. The largest pies require their own structural engineering. They are built in stages, baked in stages and carried to the table by multiple servants, where they are opened with appropriate ceremony, releasing a cloud of fragrant steam that serves as a kind of olfactory announcement of wealth. Historians still argue whether the famous nursery rhyme about 24 blackbirds baked in a pie has its origins in actual Tudor practice. There are period references to live birds being sealed inside pie crusts, the crust baked empty, the birds inserted through a hole in the bottom, so that when the pie was cut open at the table, the birds would fly out in a startling burst of feathers and chaos, delighting the guests and presumably traumatizing the birds. Whether this actually happened at Henry's table or as a later embellishment is unclear, but given everything else we know about Tudor culinary showmanship, it would be entirely in character. A small fact that tells you something about the sheer volume of food consumed. The household accounts for Hampton Court record the annual consumption of approximately 8,000 sheep, 2,300 deer, 1,200 oxen, 800 calves, and quantities of poultry that are simply listed as too numerous to count individually. This is for a household of about 800 people, eating 2 meals a day for a year. The math works out to something like 5,000 calories per person per day, which is roughly double what a moderately active modern adult needs, and which explains both the general prosperity of life at court and the specific health problems of the king, who by 1546 has ballooned to an estimated 320 pounds, and whose waist has expanded from a youthful 32 inches to a truly remarkable 52 inches. Now, if the meat is the muscle of Tudor dining, the spices are the soul, and the sugar is the status symbol that makes the whole performance sing. You need to understand something about spices in 1546 that is fundamentally different from the modern world. Today you walk into a grocery store, pick up a jar of cinnamon for a few dollars, and never think twice about it. In Tudor England, that same cinnamon travelled from the island of Ceylon across the Indian Ocean, through the hands of Portuguese traders, around the Cape of Good Hope or overland through Arabia, across the Mediterranean, through the warehouses of Venice or Antwerp, across the English Channel, up the Thames to the docks at Queen Hithe, and into the locked spicery of the royal household, where it sat behind an iron-reinforced door guarded by a clerk, who kept a ledger tracking every gram. The journey took months. The markup at each stage was enormous, and by the time that cinnamon reaches the king's custard, it has travelled roughly 8,000 miles and passed through more hands than a roomer at court. Pepper is the most commonly used spice, and even pepper is expensive enough to be counted carefully. Saffron, which comes from the dried stigmas of crocus flowers and requires roughly 75,000 flowers to produce a single pound, is so valuable that it is sometimes used as currency. The cooks use it not only for flavour, but for the magnificent golden colour it imparts to sauces and custards, a colour that reads, in the visual language of the Tudor table, as wealth and generosity and power. When the king's dishes arrive gleaming with saffron-tinted sauce, every guest understands that what they are looking at is not just food, but money, enormous quantities of money, rendered edible and displayed for their admiration. Cloves from the Moluccas, nutmeg from Banda, mace from the same distant islands, ginger from India, long pepper from Java. The spice chest of a Tudor kitchen reads like an atlas of the known world, and every ingredient represents a web of trade routes, monopolies, wars, and fortunes won and lost. A quirky fact: nutmeg was so prized that a single voyage carrying a full cargo of it could make the ship's investors wealthy for life, and the Dutch and Portuguese fought actual naval battles over control of the tiny Banda Islands, the only place on earth where nutmeg trees grew. The men fighting and dying over those islands would not have found it amusing to know that the spice they were killing for was going to end up in an English custard, but there it is. Empire in its earliest form was built one dessert at a time. And then there is sugar, which in 1546 occupies a strange position somewhere between food, medicine, and jewellery. Refined sugar comes primarily from Cyprus and the Eastern Mediterranean, and its price puts it in the same category as the spices, a luxury so expensive that it is kept under lock and key and dispensed by weight. But sugar's real role at the Tudor table is not as a sweetener for food, it is as a medium for art. The confectionery department of the royal kitchen employs specialists, sugar workers, whose job is to transform this crystalline luxury into extraordinary three-dimensional sculptures called subtleties. These are displayed between courses of a banquet, and they are designed to astonish. In 1527, when Cardinal Wolsey hosted the French ambassador at Hampton Court, the subtleties included a model of St. Paul's Cathedral complete with steeple, a chess set with all the pieces fully formed, and a scale model of a castle with working drawbridge, all made entirely from sugar paste. The guests were not expected to eat these sculptures, though they could. The base material, called marchpane, was essentially marzipan, made from pulverized blanched almonds, sugar and rosewater, baked and then iced with more sugar and rosewater. Marchpane was shaped, moulded, painted with edible colours, and gilded with gold leaf to produce objects of genuine beauty, that also happened to be dessert. If you have ever seen a modern wedding cake, you have seen the distant descendant of a Tudor subtlety, though the modern version has been significantly democratized and stripped of its political messaging. Because the subtleties were political. Everything at the Tudor table was political. The subject of a subtlety, whether it depicted a castle being conquered, a saint performing a miracle, or the royal arm surrounded by Tudor roses, sent a message, and the guests were expected to read that message and respond accordingly. A subtlety depicting the king's victory over France was an invitation to celebrate English military power. A subtlety depicting a religious scene during a period of theological controversy was a statement about where the court stood on the question of reform. Historians still argue whether the subtleties were designed primarily as entertainment or as a deliberate form of political communication, like an edible editorial cartoon, and the answer is almost certainly both. Nothing at Henry's court was ever purely one thing. Every gesture had layers, and if you could not read those layers, you were already in trouble. The sugar also did something else that is worth mentioning, because it connects directly to the title of tonight's episode. Sugar was destroying Henry's teeth. By the 1540s, the king's dental health was catastrophic, multiple missing teeth, chronic abscesses, and constant pain that contributed to his already legendary irritability. The irony is exquisite. The very substance that symbolized wealth, power, and royal generosity was quietly rotting the king from the inside out, one marchpane castle at a time. And it was not only Henry. The entire upper class of Tudor England had terrible teeth, because they were the only ones who could afford enough sugar to cause serious decay. The poor, who ate almost no sugar because they could not afford it, actually had better dental health. Wealth, in this case, was quite literally corrosive. You're beginning to understand why the title of tonight's episode is not an exaggeration. Everything about this table, the food, the drink, the protocol, the politics, is designed to impress, to intimidate, and, if you are not very careful, to kill you. And we have not even sat down to eat yet. The meal itself is a performance, choreographed with the precision of a religious ceremony, which in many ways it resembles. Before a single dish arrives, the table must be set, and the setting of the table follows a protocol so detailed that it could fill, and did fill, entire chapters of household ordinances. The process begins with the laying of the cloth. A fine linen tablecloth is spread over the table by the yeoman of the Uri, who smooths it flat with practiced hands, ensuring that it drapes evenly on all sides and that no wrinkles mar its surface. This is not fussiness. This is protocol. A wrinkled tablecloth is a sign of a disordered household, and a disordered household is a reflection on the lord, or in this case, the king, which means a wrinkled tablecloth is functionally an act of treason against linen. On the cloth goes the great salt, positioned with care at the centre of the high table. Then the trenchers, thick rounds of slightly stale bread that serve as plates, soaking up the juices and sauces of whatever is placed upon them. In wealthier settings, wooden or pewter trenchers are used instead, with the bread serving as an accompaniment rather than a platform, and by 1546 the royal household is largely using wooden trenchers for the upper tables, with bread trenchers still common in the Great Hall for the lower household. Beside each trencher goes a napkin, folded precisely. Not casually tossed, not wadded up, but folded into a neat rectangle or, for the high table, into an elaborate shape that demonstrates the skill of the server and the importance of the diner. A knife is placed to the right of the trencher and a spoon to the left. There are no forks. The fork will not become standard at English tables for another century or so. You eat with your fingers, your knife, and your spoon. And if the idea of picking up a piece of roasted swan with your bare hands strikes you as uncivilized, well, the Tudors would have considered your fork a baffling Italian affectation and probably a sign of moral weakness. The bread is brought in next. Manchet for the upper tables, cheat bread for the lower ones, all produced fresh that morning in the bakehouse. The yeoman of the pantry is formally conducted in by the usher, and he places the bread with ceremony along with the salt. There is a specific gesture involved. The pantler, the person responsible for the bread and salt, tastes the salt before placing it, and then kisses the napkin in what is called the assay. This is not affection. This is security. The assay is a ritual tasting and inspection designed to ensure that nothing on the table has been tampered with. Every item that will touch the king's lips, every piece of bread, every utensil, every goblet, is first touched to the lips of a servant who effectively says, with their body this will not kill you. Or at least, it has not killed me yet, which in Tudor terms is close enough. The ale and wine arrive in their own procession. The cellar supplies the wine, Gascon claret, sweet malmsey from the Mediterranean, sack from Spain, and the buttery supplies the ale and beer. The quantities are precisely regulated by the Eltham ordinances. A baron dining in the great watching chamber is entitled to a pitcher of wine and 2 pitchers of ale. A knight gets slightly less, a gentleman even less, and you, down in the great hall, get your 2 pints of ale and your portion of bread and meat, and you are grateful for it. Because outside these walls there are people who would consider your allotment a feast. The ordinances also specify behavioural expectations that read like a combination of etiquette manual and criminal code. You're instructed to place your hands neatly on the table when seated, not on your trencher, not folded across your belly, and to sit still. Specifically, the rules state that you should not shift your buttocks left and right, as if to let off some blast. That is a direct quote from a Tudor etiquette manual, and it is the kind of instruction that makes you realise that human nature has not changed one bit in 500 years. You're also told not to wipe your fingers on your clothes, but to use the napkin or the board cloth. You're told to undo your belt before the meal if you think you will need to loosen it for comfort, because adjusting your belt during the meal is considered bad manners. And you are told, with a specificity that suggests the problem was persistent, not to scratch your head over the food, not to pick your teeth with your knife, and not to put your elbows in other people's plates. A historical fact that adds colour to the table. The floors of the dining halls were covered with rushes, dried reeds and grasses strewn over the flagstones for warmth, comfort, and the absorption of spills, crumbs, bones tossed under the table by diners who were finished with them, and whatever the dogs contributed to the general ecology of the floor. The rushes were replaced regularly, but contemporary accounts suggest that the layers built up over time, with fresh rushes simply spread on top of old ones, creating a compacted mat that harboured all manner of organic material. Erasmus of Rotterdam, who visited England earlier in the century, was horrified by the practice, noting that beneath the rushes lay a collection of beer, grease, fragments of bone, spittle, excrement of dogs and cats, and everything that is nasty. He was not being poetic, he was being accurate, and he thought the English were disgusting, which in the matter of floor coverings they probably were. And now we come to the people whose job it is to make sure you survive the meal, the food tasters. Every dish that reaches the king's table has been tasted before it arrives, and the tasting process is not a casual nibble. It is a formal, ritualized procedure that involves multiple people and multiple stages, each one designed to reduce the chance that the king will be poisoned to as close to 0 as humanly possible, which, given that poisons in the 16th century do not always work instantly, is not actually 0 at all, but the Tudors are doing their best with the medical knowledge available to them. The first line of defence is in the kitchen itself. The master cook for the king oversees the preparation of every royal dish and tastes each one before it leaves his station. This is part of his job description, and one of the reasons the position carries both prestige and genuine risk. If the master cook drops dead of poisoning, the king is saved. If the master cook survives, the dish is presumed safe. It is a binary system, elegant in its brutality, and the master cook presumably goes about his workday with a heightened awareness of mortality that most people reserve for soldiers and tightrope walkers. The second line of defense is the sewer, not the drainage system, but the server, pronounced roughly the same way, whose job is to carry the food from the kitchen to the table. The sewer does not simply pick up the dish and walk. He participates in a procession. The food is carried through the service corridors, through the great hall, and toward the presence chamber in a formal parade, accompanied by servants bearing candles and escorted by yeoman guards. Along the way, the sewer tastes each dish again, using a small piece of bread called the assay piece, which he dips into the food, eats, and waits a moment before continuing the procession. If the sewer shows any sign of distress, which given the quality of the spicing, might be hard to distinguish from a normal reaction to extremely peppery venison, the dish is pulled from the procession and the alarm is raised. The third line of defence is at the table itself. Before the king touches any dish, his carver and cupbearer perform additional assays. The cupbearer tastes the wine, the carver tastes the meat. Every utensil that will touch the king's food is first kissed by a servant. Plates, cups, knives, spoons. In the formal gesture of assay, even the napkin is kissed, the salt is tasted, the bread is tasted. It is an extraordinary cascade of precautions that turns every meal into a slow, elaborate ritual of mutual trust, each participant putting their own life on the line as a guarantee that the next person in the chain has not introduced poison. And here is the darkest part. It does not actually work very well. Most poisons known in the 16th century, arsenic being the most common, do not produce immediate symptoms. A food taster could eat a lethal dose, declare the food safe, serve it to the king and not show symptoms for hours. By then, the king has already eaten. The food taster system provides psychological reassurance and deters casual, opportunistic poisoners, but it is largely ineffective against a determined, knowledgeable assassin. Everyone at court knows this, on some level, which is why the paranoia never truly goes away. You can taste every dish. You can kiss every plate. You can station guards at every door. And still, somewhere in the back of your mind, you know that if someone with real knowledge of poisons truly wanted to kill the king, the tasting rituals would not save him. The food tasters themselves occupy a peculiar position in the household. They are physically close to the king, closer than most courtiers will ever get, and yet their closeness is defined entirely by their willingness to die in his place. They spend hours on their knees during formal banquets, because that is the prescribed posture for a taster in the king's presence, kneeling, waiting, tasting, kneeling again. A quirky detail that captures the absurdity of the position. At extended feasts, which could last 5 or 6 hours, the food tasters might consume portions of every dish served, which means they are simultaneously performing one of the most dangerous jobs at court and eating one of the best meals in England. It is a little like being paid to test parachutes by jumping out of planes. Terrifying, yes, but the view on the way down is magnificent. Historians still argue whether the food tasting system at Henry's court was a practical security measure, a symbolic assertion of royal importance, or a residual medieval custom that had long since lost its practical value and survived purely because nobody dared suggest abolishing it. The answer depends on whom you ask. The king's physicians probably believed it was necessary. The king himself certainly believed it was necessary. After the Richard Roos incident, Henry's paranoia about poisoning was elevated to something approaching obsession. And the food tasters themselves probably had complicated feelings about the whole arrangement, which they were not at liberty to express, because complaining about the king's security protocols was not a career-enhancing move. Let us linger for a moment on a related figure, the king's cupbearer. This was an ancient court position dating back centuries, and it carried enormous honour precisely because it required the holder to taste the king's wine before every sip. Wine was considered particularly vulnerable to poisoning because its strong flavour could mask the taste of added substances, and because a poisoned goblet could be targeted at the king specifically, whereas poisoning a communal dish was a blunter instrument. The cupbearer tasted the wine, poured it into the king's goblet, and then remained at the king's side throughout the meal, available to pour and taste additional servings. He was, in essence, the king's personal poison detector, a human canary in the gold mine of Tudor dining, and his continued good health was a matter of state importance. If the cupbearer fell ill during a meal, the entire table would be cleared, the kitchen sealed, and an investigation launched with the kind of urgency usually reserved for invasions and acts of God. Now picture the king himself, because this is where the image in your head probably diverges most dramatically from reality. If you're imagining young Henry, the tall, athletic, golden-haired prince who jousted, hunted, composed music, and charmed the courts of Europe, you're about 30 years and £150 too early. The Henry of 1546 is a ruin. He is 55 years old, which in Tudor terms is elderly, and his body has been ravaged by decades of excess, injury, and untreated medical conditions. He weighs approximately 320 pounds. His waist measures 52 inches. He cannot walk unaided. He is carried from room to room in a specially constructed wooden chair borne by strong-armed servants, and when he needs to ascend or descend stairs, he is hoisted by a mechanical device, essentially a primitive lift, that has been installed at Whitehall specifically for his use. Imagine the indignity, but do not for a moment imagine that anyone would dare mention it. The source of Henry's immobility is his legs, which are covered with chronic, ulcerated wounds that have plagued him for over a decade. The ulcers began as a jousting injury, a wound to his left leg that became infected and never properly healed. Over the years, the ulcers spread, closed temporarily, reopened, and became a permanent feature of Henry's existence. By 1546, the wounds are open, weeping, and infected, producing a smell so powerful that courtiers claim they can detect the king's approach from 3 rooms away. Let that image settle. The most powerful man in England, the supreme head of the Church of England, the man who has married 6 women and executed 2 of them, and divorced 2 more, whose whim is law and whose displeasure is death. This man cannot walk, cannot climb stairs, and announces his arrival with the stench of rotting flesh. And nobody says a word about it. Nobody wrinkles their nose. Nobody suggests that perhaps the royal physicians might try a different approach, because to acknowledge the king's decay is to acknowledge that the king is mortal, and that is a thought nobody at court can afford to have. Henry's physicians treat the leg ulcers with methods that range from the ineffective to the actively torturous. They cauterize the wounds, searing them with red-hot irons, in an attempt to burn away the infection, a process that causes the king to scream with pain and that produces no lasting improvement. They apply poultices of various herbs and substances, including lead-based ointments that almost certainly made things worse. They bleed him, because bleeding is the Tudor answer to virtually every medical complaint, from headaches to hangnails. And they fuss and consult and argue among themselves, because the penalty for failing to heal the king is not a malpractice lawsuit, but a potential trip to the Tower of London, and professional disagreement takes on a distinctly sharper edge when your patient can have you executed for giving the wrong diagnosis. Alongside the leg ulcers, Henry almost certainly suffered from gout, which is an agonizing inflammatory condition caused by the buildup of uric acid crystals in the joints. Gout is triggered by the consumption of red meat, organ meats, shellfish, and alcohol, all of which Henry consumed in heroic quantities. His daily diet of approximately 5,000 calories, composed primarily of roasted meats, rich pies, spiced sauces, and accompanied by gallons of wine and ale, was essentially a prescription for gout written by a kitchen rather than a physician. The attacks came in waves, periods of excruciating pain in the feet, ankles, and knees, followed by periods of relative relief, and they made Henry even more irritable, unpredictable, and dangerous than his natural temperament already inclined him to be. There is also the question of Henry's mental state. Modern medical historians have speculated about everything from type 2 diabetes to syphilis to traumatic brain injury resulting from his jousting accidents. In 1536, 10 years before our story, Henry was knocked unconscious for 2 hours during a jousting accident in which his armoured horse fell on him. Some historians have argued that this incident caused a brain injury that fundamentally altered Henry's personality, making him more volatile, more paranoid, and more prone to the explosive rages that characterized his later reign. Historians still argue whether this is a compelling medical explanation for Henry's behaviour or a convenient, retroactive diagnosis that allows us to pathologize a man who might simply have been a tyrant. The truth, as usual, is probably somewhere in the messy middle. What is not in dispute is the effect of Henry's physical condition on the atmosphere of his court. A king in pain is a dangerous king. A king who cannot walk, who stinks of infection, who is visibly and undeniably falling apart, and who is surrounded by ambitious courtiers waiting for him to die. The king trusts no one, suspects everyone, and rules by fear because he can no longer rule by charisma. In 1546, Henry's court is a place where a single ill-timed joke, a perceived slight, a rumour about your religious sympathies, or even a facial expression that the king interprets as pity or disgust can end your career, your freedom, or your life. And you're about to sit down to dinner in this environment. You're about to eat roasted venison and drink Gascon claret while a 320-pound monarch with rotting legs and a volcanic temper sits under a canopy of state at the far end of the room, watching the court through narrowed eyes, wondering which of you is going to be the next to betray him. Sleep well, we're just getting started. By 1546, Henry's on his sixth wife. Catherine Parr, and their marriage is itself a kind of dinner party, where the guests never quite know when the host is going to overturn the table. Catherine is no ingenue. She's approximately 34 years old, already twice widowed, intelligent, well-read, and, this is the part that nearly kills her, passionately interested in religious reform. She has the habit of debating theology with Henry during their private meals, arguing in favour of Protestant ideas with an enthusiasm that impresses some of her ladies-in-waiting and terrifies everyone else. Because debating religion with Henry VIII is like playing chess with someone who can execute your bishops, in the real sense. He has literally executed bishops. John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester, went to the block in 1535, and Thomas More, the former Lord Chancellor, followed him shortly after. Henry's religious position is a labyrinth of contradictions. He has broken with Rome, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, dissolved the monasteries, and seized their wealth. But he has also maintained many Catholic doctrines, executed Protestants for heresy, and created a theological middle ground that satisfies absolutely nobody and keeps everyone in a permanent state of anxious confusion about exactly what they are allowed to believe this week. Catherine's mistake, and it is a mistake she very nearly pays for with her life, is that she forgets the first rule of dining with Henry. The king may invite discussion, but the king must always win the argument. Sometime in the summer of 1546, Henry confides to Stephen Gardiner, the Bishop of Winchester, that he is irritated by Catherine's religious opinions. Gardiner, who is a conservative Catholic and Catherine's political enemy, leaps on this opening like a fox on a rabbit. He persuades Henry to authorise an investigation into the Queen's beliefs, and before Catherine knows what is happening, a warrant has been drawn up for her arrest on suspicion of heresy. This is not a theoretical danger. Anne Askew, a young Protestant woman connected to several of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting, has already been arrested, tortured on the rack at the Tower of London, and convicted of heresy. On the 16th of July, 1546, Askew will be burned alive at Smithfield, carried to the stake in a chair because the torturers left her unable to stand. The connection between Askew and the Queen's household is not coincidental. Gardiner is building a chain of evidence designed to link Catherine to Protestant heresy, and Askew is a link in that chain. Catherine discovers the warrant, accounts differ on exactly how, and acts with the quick thinking that has characterised her survival instincts throughout her marriage. She goes to Henry, throws herself at his feet, and declares that she has never intended to instruct the king in matters of religion. She claims that her only purpose in debating theology was to distract him from the pain of his ulcerated legs, and that she wished to learn from his vastly superior wisdom. It is a masterful performance, simultaneously humble, flattering, and plausible, and Henry, whose ego is as inflated as his waistline, accepts it. When the Lord Chancellor arrives the next day to arrest Catherine, Henry sends him away with a rebuke so harsh that the bewildered Chancellor retreats in confusion. Catherine Parr survives, but the episode reveals exactly how precarious life at Henry's table really is. The Queen of England, the woman who sleeps beside the king, who dines with him every evening, who has his ear and his trust and his ring on her finger, came within hours of arrest, trial, and potentially execution, because she said the wrong thing about the wrong book at the wrong time during dinner conversation. A quirky detail that illuminates the sheer nerve-wracking nature of court dining in 1546. Catherine Parr was an accomplished patron of the arts and education, and she later became the first woman to publish a book in English under her own name, a religious text called Prayers or Meditations. The same intellectual curiosity that produced this landmark in English publishing history very nearly got her killed. and the difference between a pioneering author and a charred corpse at Smithfield came down to Catherine's ability to perform submission convincingly enough to satisfy a dying, paranoid king. If there is a more Tudor story than that, I have not found it. And this is the atmosphere that pervades every meal at court. You do not simply eat, you perform. Every word you speak, every gesture you make, every topic of conversation you raise or decline to raise is being watched, noted, interpreted, and potentially reported. The gentleman sitting across from you might be a friend. He might be an informer. He might be both, simultaneously, because in 1546, loyalty is not a fixed quality, but a constantly shifting calculation based on who is up, who is down, and who is likely to be up next week. You praise the venison. You compliment the wine. You make polite observations about the weather, the hunting, the new tapestries in the watching chamber. You do not discuss religion, because any opinion you express will be wrong in someone's estimation, and the someone whose estimation matters most changes without warning. You do not discuss politics, because the political landscape shifts like sand beneath your feet, and the alliance that keeps you safe today might be the conspiracy that dooms you tomorrow. You do not discuss the king's health, because to discuss the king's health is to discuss the king's death, and to discuss the king's death is to discuss the succession, and to discuss the succession is treason, and treason ends in one place and one place only. You talk about nothing, you smile at everyone, and you pray, with every bite you take, that the next course does not come with a side of arrest warrant. Historians still argue whether the political atmosphere at Henry's court in 1546 was uniquely toxic, or simply a more visible version of the power dynamics that characterize all autocratic courts throughout history. The parallels with other courts, the court of Ivan the Terrible, the court of Caligula, the court of the last emperors of Byzantium, suggest that there is something universal about the combination of absolute power, declining health, and no clear succession plan. What makes Henry's court distinctive is the role that religion plays in the paranoia. This is not simply a king worried about rivals. This is a king who has declared himself the head of a church, who has defined heresy as treason and treason as heresy, and who has created a system in which your beliefs about the Eucharist can get you killed just as surely as plotting an assassination. The dinner table, where conversation flows with the wine and loosened tongues reveal loosened orthodoxies, is one of the most dangerous places in this system. Let us pause the political tension for a moment and turn our attention to the drinks, because what flows into the goblets at Henry's table tells its own fascinating story, and it is one that might help you drift a little deeper into that comfortable drowsiness we're aiming for tonight. The wine cellars at Whitehall and Hampton Court are among the largest in Europe. Henry's court purchases approximately 250 tons of Gascon wine each year. That is wine from Bordeaux, shipped across the English Channel in enormous barrels, stored in cool, vaulted cellars beneath the palace, and served at the upper tables with a kind of reverence that modern sommeliers would recognise. On top of the Gascon wine, the court imports Malmsey, a rich, sweet wine from the eastern Mediterranean, from Crete and the Peloponnese, and Sack, which is a fortified wine from Spain, the ancestor of modern sherry. These are the prestige drinks, the wines that signal status, and they are served at the king's table and in the great watching chamber. You, down in the great hall, are drinking ale, but even the ale has its own story. The brewery at Hampton Court operates essentially around the clock, producing roughly 600 gallons of ale and beer per day. The ale brewer and the beer brewer are separate positions. This is important because ale and beer are genuinely different products in Tudor England. Ale is the traditional English drink, brewed from malted barley, water and yeast, without hops. It is sweet, cloudy, nourishing and perishable. It needs to be consumed within a few days of brewing before it goes sour. Beer is the newer continental alternative, brewed with the addition of hops, which give it a bitter edge and dramatically extend its shelf life. The distinction matters enough that household regulations explicitly separate the two, and the Royal Ale Brewer is specifically instructed not to contaminate his product with hops. A small historical fact, the English resistance to hops was surprisingly fierce and lasted well into the 16th century. Ale was the patriotic drink, the true English beverage, and hops were viewed by some conservatives as a corrupting foreign influence, which is a remarkably Tudor way to feel about a plant. The sheer volume of alcohol consumed at court is worth contemplating. 800 people, each receiving multiple pints of ale or beer per day, plus wine for the upper tables, plus the unofficial drinking that happens in private chambers and servants' quarters, adds up to a household that is, by modern standards, permanently lubricated. This is not binge drinking by Tudor standards. It is simply how people hydrate. Water is unsafe, milk goes bad quickly, and the only reliable source of liquid that will not make you ill is something fermented. The result is a court where virtually everyone, from the king down to the lowest scullion, maintains a baseline level of alcohol in their blood from morning to night, every day of their lives. The social implications are interesting. Decisions about war, religion, and the execution of political rivals are being made by men who have been drinking ale since breakfast. Treaties are negotiated over malmsey, marriages are arranged over sack, and the kitchen, where 200 people work with sharp knives, open fires, and boiling cauldrons, operates under conditions that would give a modern health and safety inspector an actual heart attack. A quirky detail about the wine specifically, the quality varied enormously, and the court employed a specialised official whose job was to taste and evaluate every shipment of wine before it was accepted into the cellars. Bad wine was not merely a culinary disappointment, it was a potential diplomatic incident, because the wine merchants who supplied the court were often connected to foreign trading houses with political relationships. To reject a shipment was to insult the merchant, and to insult the merchant might be to insult his patron, and patrons in the 16th century had armies. The wine taster was therefore required to combine the palate of a connoisseur with the diplomatic instincts of an ambassador, and to deliver his verdicts with enough tact, to avoid starting an international incident over a barrel of corked claret. The cellar itself was a place of genuine beauty, if you could get past the fact that it was underground, dimly lit by candles, and populated by enormous rats who had developed a sophisticated appreciation for French wine and showed no fear of humans. The barrels were arranged by type and quality, with the finest wines closest to the entrance for easy access and the cheaper wines deeper in, where the temperature was cooler and the rats were bolder. The yeomen of the cellar, who managed this subterranean kingdom, kept meticulous records of every barrel in and every barrel out, because the temptation to skim from the supply was constant and the punishments for theft were severe. Historians still argue whether the cellar workers were more honest than average or simply better at hiding their thefts, because the household accounts occasionally record discrepancies between the wine ordered and the wine served that are too large to be explained by evaporation alone. And here is something you might not expect. The wine at Tudor banquets was frequently spiced. Hippocras, a warm spiced wine made by infusing claret with sugar, cinnamon, ginger, and sometimes long pepper, was a popular after-dinner drink and was believed to aid digestion. The spicing served a dual purpose. It improved the flavour of wine that might be slightly past its best, and it displayed wealth, because the spices in a jug of Hippocras were worth more than the wine itself. Drinking Hippocras at the end of a meal was the Tudor equivalent of ordering an expensive cognac, a final extravagant gesture that said, "I have eaten more than I needed, drunk more than I should have, and now I am going to drink something that costs more than your monthly wages because I can. You in the Great Hall do not get Hippocras. You get ale and, if you are lucky, a small cup of the cheaper wine that trickles down from the upper tables, but you can smell the Hippocras wafting from the watching chamber above you, warm and sweet and spicy, and the smell alone is enough to remind you of your place in the hierarchy. Let us come back to the bread, because in Tudor England, bread is never just bread. It is a social document, a class marker, and, in the case of the royal household, a logistical challenge of impressive proportions. The bakehouse at Hampton Court, and Whitehall has its equivalent, operates through the night, because the bread must be fresh for the morning meal, and producing enough loaves for 800 people takes time, skill, and a truly prodigious quantity of flour. There are two primary types of bread in the royal household, and the type you receive tells everyone around you exactly who you are. Manchet is the superior bread, fine, white, made from wheat flour that has been sifted through a bolting cloth to remove the bran and produce a light, delicate loaf. It is soft, fragrant and slightly sweet, closer to a modern brioche than to anything you would find in a medieval peasant's cottage. Manchet is served at the upper tables to the king, the queen, the nobility, and the senior household officers. It is a luxury product. The wheat it requires is expensive, the The sifting process is labour-intensive, and the result is a bread that practically whispers money when you tear it open. Cheat bread is what everyone else gets. Cheat, from the Old English word meaning bran or husks, is made from flour that has been less thoroughly sifted, retaining more of the bran and producing a denser, darker, more assertively flavoured loaf. It is perfectly nutritious. It is filling. It tastes fine, honestly, especially when it's fresh and warm from the oven. But it is not manchet, and everyone knows it is not manchet, and the difference is visible from across the room. The whiteness of your bread is a shorthand for your rank, and this equation, white bread equals high status, dark bread equals low status, will persist in English culture for centuries, which is ironic given that modern nutritionists would tell you the dark bread is considerably better for you. Below cheat bread, for the very lowest servants, and for distribution to the poor who gather at the palace gates, there is horse bread, a heavy coarse loaf made from a mixture of whatever flour is available, often including rye, oats, or even beans. It is called horse bread because it was traditionally fed to horses, and the fact that it is also fed to the poorest humans tells you everything about the Tudor social hierarchy without requiring a single additional word. The bakehouse itself is a noisy, dusty, intensely hot environment. The ovens are brick-built structures that are heated by burning wood inside them, then sweeping out the ashes and inserting the loaves to bake in the residual heat. The bakers work in shifts, kneading enormous quantities of dough by hand. The mechanical bread-kneading machine is still centuries away, and they are among the few kitchen workers who start their day even earlier than the cooks because the bread must be ready before the first meal at 10 in the morning. A quirky detail. The bakers were known for developing exceptionally strong forearms from years of kneading, and there are records of bakers being recruited for other physical tasks in the household, specifically because of their upper body strength. The Tudor baker was, in a very real sense, the original gym bro, though his gym was a flour-covered room at 4. In the morning, and his equipment was a 100-pound mass of raw dough. The bread also serves a practical function that connects to the dining ritual. Trenchers. The flat rounds of bread used as plates at the lower tables are made from bread that is a few days old, specifically because stale bread absorbs juices without disintegrating. Fresh bread would fall apart under the weight of a sauce-drenched piece of venison. Stale bread holds its shape, serves its purpose, and then, at the end of the meal, is collected in large baskets called voiders and carried to the almoner, the household officer responsible for distributing the king's charity. The almoner takes the used trenchers, along with other leftovers from the meal, and distributes them to the poor who wait at the palace gates. This is not generosity, it is protocol. The Eltham ordinances specifically mandate the collection and distribution of leftovers, and the almoner's role is a formal household position with its own staff and budget. But the effect is the same. The bread that was your plate at dinner becomes someone else's dinner, and the hierarchy of the table extends beyond the palace walls into the streets of London, where the poor eat the literal leavings of the rich and are expected to be grateful for it. Historians still argue whether the Tudor system of distributing leftovers to the poor was a genuine expression of Christian charity, a cynical public relations exercise designed to prevent social unrest, or simply a practical solution to the problem of what to do with the enormous quantities of uneaten food that a court producing 5,000 calories per person per day inevitably generates. The answer, as with most things Tudor, is probably all three simultaneously. Henry's court was nothing if not efficient at making a single act serve multiple purposes. There is something soporific about bread, is there not? The smell of it baking, the warmth of a fresh loaf, the soft tear of the crust. Even in 1546, in the middle of all this danger and paranoia and political intrigue, there is something fundamentally comforting about the fact that somewhere in the basement of Whitehall Palace, a flour-dusted baker is pulling a tray of manchet from the oven at 4 in the morning, and the smell of it drifts up through the corridors and staircases and reaches the sleeping courtiers in their chambers, and for a moment, before the day begins and the performance resumes, the palace just smells like bread. The trumpet sounds, not a fanfare from a movie soundtrack, a real physical trumpet blown by a member of the household musicians, its clear bright tone cutting through the murmur of conversation and the clatter of preparations. This is the signal that the meal is about to be served, and the effect on the assembled company is immediate. Conversations halt mid-sentence, servants snap to attention, Dogs are kicked under tables with more urgency than usual. And throughout the Great Hall, the Great Watching Chamber, and the Presence Chamber, hundreds of people settle into their precisely assigned seats and compose their faces into expressions of appropriate anticipation. The food arrives in procession. This is not an exaggeration or a metaphor. The dishes are carried from the kitchen through the service corridors and into the dining areas in a formal parade, led by the yeoman usher, who carries a white rod of office and walks with the measured pace of a man who knows that the entire household is watching him. Behind him come the sewers and serving men, each bearing a dish covered with a cloth to keep it warm and protect it from contamination, or, less charitably, from the dogs. The procession moves through the Great Hall first, depositing dishes at the lower tables, and then continues upward through the hierarchy of rooms, with the finest dishes reserved for the king's table in the presence chamber. At the lower tables, where you are seated, the service is efficient but relatively simple. The dishes arrive, the covers are removed, and you help yourself with your fingers, your knife, and your spoon, taking portions from the communal platters and placing them on your trencher. The food at this level is hearty but unremarkable. Pottage, roasted or boiled beef, bread, and ale. It is filling. It is nutritious by Tudor standards. And it is a vast improvement over what most people in England are eating tonight, which is why the lower household members generally eat with genuine enthusiasm and minimal complaint, despite the fact that they can see and smell the far superior dishes being carried past them on their way to the upper tables. At the upper tables, the service is a different matter entirely. Each dish is presented with ceremony, the covers removed with a flourish, the food arranged on the table in a specific order dictated by the Eltham ordinances. The most prestigious dish is placed closest to the highest-ranking diner, and the arrangement radiates outward in diminishing importance, so that even the layout of the food on the table is a map of the social hierarchy. The servers bow before placing each dish. The carver, a position of genuine honour in the household, stands at the head of the table and carves the meat with professional skill, distributing portions according to rank. The cupbearer pours the wine, and around the edges of the room, attendants stand ready to refill cups, replace soiled napkins, bring additional bread, and generally ensure that the dining experience is as smooth and uninterrupted as the complicated machinery of Tudor service can make it. The meal is structured in 2 courses, each containing multiple dishes. The first course typically features the heavier meats, beef, mutton, venison, along with the great pies and the pottages. The second course brings the lighter meats, poultry, game birds, fish, along with the sweet dishes, the tarts, and the custards. Between the courses, at formal banquets, the subtleties appear, those extraordinary sugar sculptures that we discussed earlier, carried in with appropriate ceremony and set on the table for admiration and gentle consumption. The entire meal lasts at least 2 hours on ordinary days and can extend to 5 or 6 hours on feast days, during which time you are expected to eat, drink, converse, observe the proper courtesies, and maintain your composure no matter how much ale you have consumed or how desperately you need to use the privy. A historical fact that adds texture to the scene. The noise level during a Tudor court meal is considerable, but it is not chaos. There is conversation, but it is conducted at a moderate volume, because shouting at the table is forbidden by the Eltham ordinances. There is the sound of eating, knives on trenchers, spoons in bowls, the tearing of bread, the quiet slurp of soup. There is the shuffling of servers' feet on the rush-covered floor. There is music because the household musicians play during meals, usually from a gallery above the hall, filling the room with lute, recorder and sackbut, the ancestor of the trombone, in a gentle wash of sound that serves as both entertainment and white noise. And there is, always, the sound of dogs, because despite Wolsey's best efforts and the explicit regulations of the Eltham ordinances, the dogs are still here, still circling under the tables, still snatching fallen scraps with the silent efficiency of professionals who know exactly what they are doing. A quirky detail: the household musicians were required to learn a repertoire of pieces specifically chosen for their soothing qualities during dinner. Loud martial music was reserved for arrivals, departures, and celebrations. Dinner music was softer, calmer, designed to aid digestion and promote pleasant conversation, the Tudor equivalent of a restaurant playlist. Henry himself was a composer and musician of some talent, and he is known to have strong opinions about the music played at his table, occasionally calling for specific pieces or dismissing musicians whose playing displeased him. It is entirely possible that some of the music you are hearing tonight was composed by the king himself, played by nervous musicians who are very aware that their performance is being judged by a man who combines genuine musical knowledge with the power of life and death. Historians still argue whether Henry's surviving musical compositions, including the famous pastime with good company, were entirely his own work or collaborative efforts polished by court musicians who wisely attributed all credit to the royal composer. The music itself is charming, technically competent, and exactly the kind of thing a talented amateur with unlimited resources and no one willing to offer honest criticism would produce. Make of that what you will, if you're fortunate enough, or unfortunate enough depending on your perspective, to be invited to dine in the Great Watching Chamber rather than the Great Hall, the experience shifts dramatically. The Watching Chamber is smaller, more intimate, and significantly more intense. The tapestries here are finer, depicting biblical scenes and allegorical figures in rich wool and silk thread that catches the candlelight. The ceiling is higher and more elaborately decorated. The table is set with pewter and silver rather than wood, and the company is composed of people who actually matter: knights, barons, senior household officers, visiting ambassadors, and the occasional bishop, all of whom are engaged in the ceaseless, exhausting work of being seen, being noticed, and being careful. The food in the Watching Chamber is noticeably superior to what is served in the Great Hall. Where the lower tables receive pottage and boiled beef, the upper tables receive roasted game, venison in elaborate sauces, poultry prepared in multiple styles, fish dishes for those observing a fast day, and the ornate pies that are the pride of the pastry kitchen. The wine is real, Gascon claret, malmsey, sack, served in quantity and replenished by attentive cupbearers. The bread is manchy, soft and white and fragrant. And the subtleties, when they appear, are the genuine article. Sugar sculptures of extraordinary detail and ingenuity, representing castles, ships, churches, and sometimes topical scenes designed to flatter the king or comment on recent events. But the real difference between the Great Hall and the Watching Chamber is not the food. It is the conversation. In the Great Hall you can relax, relatively speaking. The lower household talks about ordinary things, their families, their home counties, the latest gossip from the stables, the quality of this week's ale, the alarming behaviour of someone's dog. In the Watching Chamber, every word is political. The man to your left is a member of the Privy Council. The woman across from you is a lady-in-waiting to the Queen. The bishop at the head of the table has the ear of Stephen Gardiner, who has the ear of the king. Everything you say in this room can be reported, interpreted, distorted, and used. The walls do not merely have ears, they have notebooks and excellent memories and a keen understanding of exactly how to present a casual remark in the worst possible light. You learn very quickly the art of saying nothing while appearing to say something. You develop a repertoire of pleasant, meaningless observations that can be deployed at a moment's notice. How excellent the venison is tonight! How fine the weather has been this week! How splendid the new tapestry looks! You become an expert at the non-answer, the graceful deflection, the smile that acknowledges a question without actually engaging with it. You learn to laugh at jokes without committing to the premise, to nod in agreement without specifying what you're agreeing with, and to change the subject with the smooth efficiency of a river rounding a bend. These are survival skills, as essential to your continued existence as the ability to ride a horse or wield a sword, and far more likely to be tested on any given day. A historical fact about the Watching Chamber: the yeomen of the guard who stood watch at its entrance were among the oldest military unit in the English household. Established by Henry VII in 1485 after the Battle of Bosworth Field, the yeomen were the king's personal bodyguards, selected for their loyalty, their physical imposing nature, and their willingness to stand still for very long periods of time while wearing a lot of red and gold. By 1546, there are approximately 200 yeomen of the guard, and their presence at the entrance to the Watching Chamber serves as a physical reminder that the space you are about to enter is not merely a dining room. It is an extension of the king's person, and it is guarded accordingly. The yeomen check credentials, inspect visitors, and occasionally refuse entry to people whose rank, behaviour, or reputation does not meet the standard required. Being turned away at the door of the Watching Chamber is a public humiliation of the first order, because everyone who witnesses it understands that you have been judged and found wanting, and in a court where reputation is everything, that kind of judgment can take months to recover from. A quirky detail. The yeomen of the guard were also responsible for searching the rooms beneath the watching chamber and the presence chamber before each meal, looking for hidden threats. This practice, checking the cellars for intruders and explosives, would later become institutionalised as the ceremonial search of the Houses of Parliament, which is still performed to this day before the state opening, a tradition that descends directly from the security anxieties of Tudor kings. Every time the Lord Great Chamberlain leads a group of yeomen through the cellars of Westminster, they are performing a ritual that began with someone checking that Richard Roos had not returned from the grave with another pot of poisoned porridge. The watching chamber also serves as the setting for one of the more peculiar rituals of Tudor court life, the Sunday procession. On Sundays and major feast days, the king and queen, accompanied by their retinue, process through the watching chamber on their way to the chapel royal. This is a public event. The watching chamber is filled with courtiers and spectators who stand along the walls as the royal party passes, and it serves as one of the few occasions when the king is visible to the wider court. Henry, by 1546, makes this procession in his carrying chair, borne by servants, his swollen legs wrapped in bandages, his face set in an expression of regal composure that requires a heroic effort of will. The courtiers bow as he passes. Nobody looks at his legs. Nobody mentions the smell, and the procession continues to the chapel, where everyone kneels and prays and pretends that the man they are praying for is not visibly dying in front of them. Historians still argue whether these Sunday processions in 1546 were acts of defiance by a king who refused to admit his own decline, or carefully managed public relations exercises designed to reassure the court that Henry was still in command. The truth is probably both, because Henry was simultaneously the most powerful and the most vulnerable man in England, and the gap between those two realities was widening every day. Now let us ascend to the summit of the dining hierarchy. The king's own table in the presence chamber where Henry eats alone. Not alone as in unattended. There are servants everywhere. The carver, the cupbearer, the sewer, the food tasters, the musicians, the gentlemen in attendance, but alone in the sense that no other person sits at his table. This is by design. The king dines in solitary splendour, under a canopy of state, an elaborate fabric canopy, richly embroidered with the royal arms, that hangs above his chair as a symbol of sovereignty. The canopy is not decorative, it is constitutional. Its presence declares that the person beneath it is the monarch, and it transforms whatever space it occupies into a throne room, whether that space is a formal state chamber or, on occasion, a tent in a muddy field. Where the canopy goes, the king's authority goes. The table itself is set with the finest plate. Silver and silver-gilt dishes, goblets and platters, some of them works of art in their own right, commissioned from the best goldsmiths in London and the continent. The tablecloth is the whitest linen. The napkins are folded into shapes so intricate they resemble origami. The salt cellar at the king's table is not merely a container for salt. It is a towering piece of goldsmith's work, possibly in the shape of a ship, possibly encrusted with jewels and certainly worth more than most houses in London. Everything about this table is designed to communicate a single message. The person who eats here is not like other people. He is above them. He is apart from them. He is the centre around which the entire court revolves, and the food, the plate, the canopy, and the ceremony are all expressions of that centrality. Henry's 13-dish minimum arrives in its own dedicated procession, carried by his personal household servants, and preceded by essays at every stage. The dishes are arranged on the table in a specific pattern, with the most prestigious items closest to the king. He does not eat everything. He could not eat everything, even given his enormous appetite. He surveys the offerings, selects what appeals to him, and the rest is carried away. Some of it to be served at the upper tables as a mark of the king's generosity. A gift of food from the royal table is a significant honour, and the rest to join the leftovers destined for the almoner's basket. What does Henry actually eat? By 1546, his diet reflects both his physical condition and his personal preferences. He's fond of venison, which is a symbol of royal privilege since only the king and those he specifically licenses are allowed to hunt deer in the royal forests. He eats beef in large quantities. He consumes roasted poultry, capons, chickens, and game birds when they are in season. He has a well-documented sweet tooth, which his physicians discourage but cannot control, and the custards, tarts, and marchpane that conclude each meal are consumed with evident pleasure. His wine intake is substantial, multiple goblets of Gascon claret or malmsey during a single meal, and this, combined with the heroic quantities of meat and sugar, is slowly and relentlessly destroying his body from the inside. A small but telling detail: by 1546 Henry's teeth are in terrible condition. Decades of sugar consumption have left his mouth a landscape of decay, missing teeth and chronic abscesses that cause constant pain and make eating certain foods difficult. The irony, as we discussed earlier, is that the very wealth that fills his table with sugar is the same wealth that is rotting his teeth. His physicians prescribe clove oil for the pain, cloves being one of the few spices with genuine analgesic properties, and Henry is known to have kept small sachets of ground cloves nearby at mealtimes, pressing them against his gums when the pain becomes unbearable. There is something almost poignant about this image: the King of England, surrounded by the most extravagant feast in the country, pressing a pinch of powdered spice against his bleeding gums while he tries to chew through another piece of venison. Power does not protect you from your own appetites. It merely ensures that you can indulge them until they destroy you. The servants who attend Henry at table are selected for their discretion as much as their skill. They see everything: the swollen legs, the wincing pain, the difficulty Henry has in reaching for dishes, because his belly prevents him from leaning forward, the moments when he stops eating and stares into the middle distance with an expression that might be pain or might be something else entirely, something closer to the recognition that he is running out of time. These servants never speak of what they see. Their silence is part of their job, perhaps the most important part, because the fiction of the King's Majesty depends on the complicity of everyone who witnesses its failures. Historians still argue whether Henry in his final year was still genuinely engaged in governing, or whether the real decisions were being made by the factions competing for control of the coming regency, the future Edward VI being only 9 years old, while Henry was distracted by pain, food, and the increasingly desperate efforts of his physicians to keep him alive. The evidence suggests both. Henry was still issuing orders, still terrifying his courtiers, still capable of sudden, decisive action that reminded everyone that the dying lion was still a lion. But the teeth were falling out, the legs were rotting, and the canopy of state hung over a man who was, in every sense except the legal one, already leaving the world he had so thoroughly dominated. A quirky detail about the presence chamber: the room was heated by an enormous fireplace, and Henry, who was always cold despite his bulk, poor circulation probably compounded by the lack of physical activity, insisted on a roaring fire even in relatively mild weather. The servants who attended him in this overheated room sweated through their liveries while maintaining expressions of perfect comfort, because to show discomfort in the king's presence was to imply that the king's preferences were wrong, and the king's preferences were, by definition, never wrong. It was, in essence, a sauna with political consequences. Between the first and second courses, as the subtleties are displayed and admired, the pace of the meal shifts. This is the interval, the breathing space, and it is during this period that the most important social interactions of the day often occur. Courtiers leave their seats, carefully, because abandoning your place at the wrong moment is a faux pas, and circulate, paying their respects to higher-ranking diners, exchanging whispered words with allies, and keeping a watchful eye on the movements of their rivals. This is when the real business of the court happens, not in the council chamber, not in the chapel, but in the gaps between the venison and the peacock. A quiet word in someone's ear, a sealed note passed beneath a napkin, a meaningful glance across the room. The court in 1546 is divided into factions. Broadly, the Conservatives led by Stephen Gardiner and Thomas Wriothesley, and the Reformers led by Edward Seymour and John Dudley. And the dining hour is when these factions take each other's temperature, assess each other's strength, and probe for weakness. Every conversation is a negotiation. Every friendship is a potential alliance. And every silence is potentially an accusation, because in a world where not speaking is sometimes as dangerous as speaking too much, the absence of a greeting can be as meaningful as a declaration of war. You, as a minor courtier, are largely invisible in these power games, which is both a protection and a frustration. Nobody is trying to recruit you because you are not important enough to be worth the effort. But nobody is trying to destroy you either, for the same reason. You exist in the comfortable obscurity of insignificance, watching the great men of the realm maneuver, around each other like ships in a narrow harbour, each one trying to reach the best berth without colliding with the others. It is fascinating to watch, in the way that watching a chess game is fascinating, intellectually stimulating, occasionally dramatic, and suffused with the knowledge that you are not one of the pieces, but you are learning. Every dinner teaches you something about how power works in this court. You notice that Sir Anthony Denny, the chief gentleman of the Privy Chamber, always speaks last in any group conversation, and that when he does speak, the others fall silent. You notice that Edward Seymour, the Earl of Hertford and the future Lord Protector, has the habit of standing very close to the people he is addressing, leaning in with an intensity that makes them lean back. You notice that Stephen Gardiner, the Bishop of Winchester, laughs too loudly at other people's jokes and watches the room with the unblinking attention of a hawk circling a field. These observations are not gossip. They are intelligence. And in 1546, intelligence is the only commodity that a minor courtier possesses in any quantity. A historical fact that illustrates the dangers of the between courses interval. In the years leading up to 1546, several courtiers were arrested or investigated based on conversations overheard during meals. The great halls and watching chambers of Tudor palaces were not private spaces. They were public arenas, and the acoustics were often better than the speakers realised. A whispered comment about the king's health, a joke about the queen's reading habits, a casual remark about the price of candles that somehow gets twisted into a complaint about the king's extravagance. Any of these could be reported, amplified, and weaponized by an enemy with access to the right ears. The court employed no formal network of informers, but it did not need to. Everyone was an informer, potentially, because information was currency and loyalty was negotiable, and the person sitting next to you at dinner might be your friend today and your accuser tomorrow. A quirky detail about the social dynamics of the interval. Gifts of food were a significant feature of Tudor court life. If a high-ranking courtier wished to honour a lower-ranking one, he might send a dish from his own table, a portion of the roasted venison, a slice of marchpane, a goblet of the better wine. The gift was carried by a servant and presented with a verbal message. My lord so-and-so sends his compliments and this dish for your enjoyment. Receiving such a gift was an honour. Refusing it was an insult. And the entire transaction was witnessed by dozens of people who immediately began calculating what the gift meant in terms of political alignment, personal favour, and the ever-shifting landscape of courtly alliances. A piece of pie in this context was never just a piece of pie. It was a diplomatic communiqué wrapped in pastry. Historians still argue whether the gift-giving culture of the Tudor court was a genuine expression of generosity and social bonding, or a sophisticated system of bribery and obligation disguised as hospitality. The line between the two is thin, and was probably thinner in the 16th century than it is today. When a man who controls access to the king sends you a dish of venison, the appropriate response is gratitude, and gratitude has a way of becoming obligation, and obligation has a way of becoming loyalty. And loyalty in 1546 is the most valuable and the most dangerous thing you can offer. But the venison is delicious, and you are hungry, and the wine is flowing, and the music is playing, and for a moment, just a moment, you can almost forget that this dinner is a battlefield. The trumpets sound again, and the second course arrives. The mood shifts with the food. Where the first course was heavy, beef, mutton, the great pies, the second course is lighter, brighter, more playful. Roasted capons glazed with saffron sauce, their skin golden and gleaming. Partridge and quail, small birds roasted whole and served on beds of fresh herbs. Freed sole and baked trout for those observing the fish day, or simply preferring something less aggressively meaty. Tarts filled with egg custard and cream, dusted with sugar and rose water. Fruit, preserved rather than fresh, because fresh fruit is viewed with deep suspicion by Tudor physicians who believe it causes illness. Quinces cooked in honey, pears in wine, and the marchpane, those beautiful almond and sugar confections shaped into towers, flowers and knots, gilded with gold leaf and painted with vegetable. Dyes to achieve colours so vivid they seem to glow in the candlelight. The atmosphere in the hall shifts too. The ale has been flowing for an hour now, and the conversation has loosened accordingly. The first course is the course of protocol. You sit straight, you eat carefully, you mind your manners. The second course is the course of relaxation. Belts are loosened, as the Eltham ordinances anticipated. Voices rise slightly, though not too much, because the ordinances also anticipated that. Laughter becomes more frequent. The musicians, sensing the change, shift to livelier pieces, Not quite dance music, but something with more movement, more melody. A rhythm that matches the brightening mood of the room. The poultry of the second course gives us an opportunity to talk about something important. The role of birds in Tudor dining, which goes far beyond the merely nutritional. We have already discussed swan and peacock, the showpiece birds, but the everyday poultry of the Tudor table is a story in itself. Capons, castrated roosters, fattened to produce tender, flavourful meat, are the workhouse of the upper table. They appear at virtually every meal, roasted, boiled, baked in pies, and served in sauces ranging from simple bread sauce to elaborate preparations involving verjuice, sugar and cinnamon. The capon is to the Tudor table what the chicken breast is to the modern gym enthusiast, omnipresent, versatile, and entirely taken for granted. Beyond capons, the Tudor kitchen processes an astonishing variety of birds. Pigeons, both domestic and wild, are eaten in huge numbers. Larks and plovers are served as delicacies, their tiny bodies roasted whole and eaten bones and all. Herons and bitterns, large long-legged wading birds, appear on feast day menus, valued more for their rarity than their flavour. And then there are the birds that modern diners would find frankly bizarre. Cormorants, puffins, and barnacle geese, all of which are classified as fish for the purposes of Lenten dietary restrictions. Because medieval theologians concluded that since these birds were associated with water, they were fundamentally aquatic creatures, and therefore acceptable to eat on fish days. This logic was applied with a straight face and enforced with genuine conviction. And if it strikes you as absurd, well, you're not wrong. But you also do not live in a world where the wrong opinion about the Eucharist can get you burned at the stake. So perhaps the barnacle goose question is not the hill you want to die on. A quirky detail about the poultry supply. Henry's court consumed such enormous quantities of birds that the palace maintained its own dovecotes, elaborate structures housing hundreds of breeding pigeons, and employed professional fowlers who supplied wild birds from the marshes and fields surrounding London. The fowlers used a variety of methods, including nets, snares, and a technique involving trained hawks that chased flocks of smaller birds into waiting nets. It was skilled work, seasonal and occasionally dangerous, because the marshes were treacherous terrain and the hawks had minds of their own. But the demand was constant, and the fowlers who supplied the royal kitchen were well compensated, because a reliable supply of fresh pigeon was considered essential to the smooth running of the household. The fish of the second course deserves its own mention, because the Tudor relationship with fish is complicated in ways that go beyond mere cuisine. The church mandated fish days, Wednesdays, Fridays, Saturdays, and the entirety of Lent, during which the consumption of meat from warm-blooded animals was forbidden. This was a religious obligation, but it was also an economic policy, because the fishing industry depended on it, and the Crown had a vested interest in maintaining a large fleet of fishing vessels that could be converted to naval use in wartime. Henry, who had broken with Rome but maintained many Catholic practices when it suited him, enforced fish days with varying enthusiasm, and the royal kitchen kept a separate fish, kitchen specifically for the preparation of fish day meals. The fish available to the kitchen includes both freshwater and saltwater species. Pike from the palace ponds, large, predatory freshwater fish that are considered a delicacy. Carp, recently introduced to England and kept in purpose-built fish ponds. Salmon from the Thames, which in 1546 is still a viable salmon river, something that would astonish anyone familiar with the Victorian Thames. Eels, which are enormously popular and prepared in dozens of ways, baked, fried, stewed, made into pies. And from the sea, cod, sole, plaice, herring, and the exotic imports like conger eel and lamprey, that ancient, jawless, parasitic fish that has been a royal delicacy since the Norman conquest, and that William the Conqueror's son, Henry I, allegedly died from eating too many of in 1135. Whether Henry VIII knows this story and considers it a cautionary tale or a challenge is sadly not recorded. Historians still argue whether the Tudor upper class genuinely enjoyed fish, or merely endured it as a religious obligation, compensating for the lack of meat by adding enormous quantities of butter, cream, and spices to their fish preparations. The kitchen accounts suggest the latter. The spice consumption on fish days is notably higher than on meat days, which implies that the cooks were working overtime to make the fish palatable to palates accustomed to roasted venison and capons in saffron sauce. Fish day, in the royal kitchen, was apparently a challenge, not a pleasure. As you sit in the great hall, eating your second-course capon and drinking your ale, it is worth remembering what the world outside the palace looks like, because the contrast between the feast inside and the reality outside is one of the most striking features of Tudor England, and understanding it helps explain why so many people are willing to endure the dangers of court life for the privilege of eating below the salt. England in 1546 is a country of roughly 3 million people, most of whom live in small rural communities and work the land. The average diet of an English peasant is centred on bread, pottage, cheese, and whatever vegetables they can grow or gather. Meat is a luxury, eaten perhaps once or twice a week if you are fortunate, and never in the quantities or varieties available at court. A labourer earning 6 pence a day, a decent wage, spends roughly 80% of his income on food, and that food is monotonous, seasonal, and frequently insufficient. The harvest of 1546 is adequate but not abundant, and memories of the truly bad years, when the rains came and the grain rotted in the fields and the price of bread doubled and people starved, are fresh enough to keep the spectre of hunger real for anyone who lives outside the palace walls. Inside the palace, 800 people are consuming 5,000 calories each per day. Outside the palace, their neighbours are eating perhaps half that on a good day, and considerably less on a bad one. The mathematics of this imbalance are simple and brutal, and they explain the crowd that gathers at the palace gates each evening when the almoner distributes the leftovers. These are not beggars in the modern sense. Many of them are working people, labourers, servants from nearby households, washerwomen, porters, who supplement their meagre diets with the food that the court produces in excess and throws away. The used trenchers, the bones with meat still clinging to them, the scraps of pie crust, the dregs of ale, all of it is collected, carried to the gate, and distributed by the almoner's staff to the waiting crowd with the organised efficiency of a military supply operation. This is charity on an industrial scale, and it is one of the functions of the royal household that the Eltham ordinances take most seriously, because a hungry crowd outside the palace is a potentially angry crowd. And angry crowds in Tudor England have a history of becoming rebellious crowds, and rebellious crowds are bad for everyone, including kings. A historical fact that puts the palace's consumption in perspective. The annual household accounts record the purchase of approximately 8,000 sheep, 2,300 deer, 1,200 oxen, 800 calves, and truly uncountable quantities of poultry, fish, and game birds. These numbers represent the appetites of a community the size of a large village, concentrated in a single building, eating the equivalent of what dozens of normal villages would consume in the same period. The logistics of supplying this appetite, the herds driven to the palace slaughterhouse, the carts of grain rolling in from the countryside, the fishing boats on the Thames, the hunting parties in the royal forests, are a significant element of the English economy. The palace is not just a residence, it is a mouth, an enormous, insatiable mouth that devours the produce of the surrounding countryside and transforms it into spectacle, status, and political power. A quirky detail about the supply chain: the palace had its own slaughterhouse, located at a discreet distance from the main building so that the sounds and smells of killing would not disturb the courtiers. The slaughterhouse was staffed by professional butchers who processed the animals into cuts suitable for the kitchen, and the waste, hides, bones, offal, was sold to merchants and tanners, creating a secondary economy around the palace's primary one. Nothing was wasted. Even the blood was collected and used in making black pudding, a sausage stuffed with blood, oatmeal, and fat that was a staple of the lower household's diet and that most modern diners would find either intriguing or horrifying, depending on their relationship with breakfast. The contrast between inside and outside becomes even sharper when you consider the clothing. Inside the palace, the courtiers are dressed in silk, velvet, fur-trimmed robes, and embroidered doublets in colours regulated by the sumptuary laws, which dictate what fabrics and colours each rank is permitted to wear. Outside the palace, the working population wears wool, linen and leather, in undyed or dull-coloured fabrics that reflect both their economic status and the legal restrictions on display. The visual difference is absolute. A courtier dining in the watching chamber in his crimson velvet doublet and his fur-lined gown is a creature from a different world than the labourer waiting it. The gate for a piece of used trencher bread and the palace wall that separates them is not merely physical, it is a boundary between two versions. of England that coexist in the same geography but share almost nothing in terms of experience, expectation, or possibility. And yet the palace needs the world outside its walls as desperately as the world outside needs the palace's leftovers. Every log that feeds the kitchen fires was cut by a labourer's axe. Every sheep that becomes a roast was raised by a farmer's family. Every barrel of wine that fills the cellar was carried by a merchant's crew across dangerous seas. The feast you're enjoying tonight is the endpoint of a vast network of labour, trade and exploitation that stretches from the forests of southern England to the vineyards of Bordeaux, from the spice markets of Venice to the fishing grounds of the North Sea. Every bite you take contains a small compressed history of human effort and human suffering, and the fact that you never see any of it, that the food simply appears on the table in beautiful procession, as if conjured from air, is the final and most effective illusion of Tudor power. Historians still argue whether the Tudor court's extravagant consumption was economically beneficial, creating demand, supporting trade, employing thousands, or economically parasitic, draining the countryside's resources to support a self-indulgent elite. The answer, characteristically, is both. The court was an engine of consumption that drove economic activity and concentrated wealth in the same gesture, and the leftovers distributed at the gate were both a genuine form of welfare and a symbolic acknowledgement that the system was producing winners and losers, and that the losers were hungry enough to wait outside the palace for scraps. The second course is ending now, the last of the tarts consumed, the marchpane reduced to crumbs and gilded fragments, the wine jugs emptied and carried away. The musicians shift to their gentlest repertoire, slow melodies played softly, the lute barely audible above the murmur of conversation, the sackbut breathing low notes that seem to dissolve into the candlelight. The candles themselves are burning lower, the tallow ones in the great hall guttering and smoking, filling the upper air with a greasy haze, while the beeswax candles in the watching chamber and presence chamber burn cleaner and steadier. Their light warm and golden and kind, you are full, fuller perhaps than you have ever been. The combination of bread, pottage, roasted beef, ale, and the small portions of capon and custard that trickle down from the upper tables has left you in a state of heavy, contented satiation that sits on your chest like a warm animal. This is not an accident. The abundance of the table is designed to produce exactly this feeling, a sense of being provided for, of being part of something larger and more generous than yourself, of owing your comfort to the man under the canopy of state, the man whose kitchens produced this meal and whose generosity allowed you to eat it. Every full belly at court is a small act of loyalty, purchased not with threats, but with venison. The hall is emptying slowly. The lower household drifts away to their lodgings, which for most of them means shared rooms in the outer buildings of the palace complex. Small, crowded, unheated chambers where 4 or 6 servants sleep on straw pallets on the floor, wrapped in blankets that are provided by the household and laundered at irregular intervals. The senior servants have better quarters, private rooms, or at least rooms shared with only one other person, and the highest-ranking courtiers occupy suites in the main buildings, with fireplaces, beds with hangings, and windows that overlook the gardens or the river. Your own lodging is modest, but adequate. A small chamber on the second floor of one of the courtyard buildings, shared with another young gentleman of similar rank, furnished with 2 pallets, a joint stool, a chest for your belongings, and a single candlestick. There is no fireplace. The warmth comes from the body heat of 2 men in a small room, plus whatever residual warmth rises from the kitchens below, which, since the kitchens never entirely stop, is enough to keep the room from freezing on most nights. But before you retire, there is the matter of the privy, which is a subject that Tudor historians approach with the fascination that the Tudors themselves apparently did not share. The palace has multiple privies, called jakes, or houses of easement, ranging from the king's own private privy, which is a padded, curtained affair with its own attendant, the groom of the stool, one of the most senior positions in the household, whose proximity to the king's most intimate moments gives him extraordinary political influence, down to the common privies shared by the lower household, which are essentially wooden seats over open drains that empty into the Thames or into cesspits that are periodically cleaned by workmen whose job title, gong farmer, is derived from the Old English word for privy, and whose working conditions require no further description. A quirky detail, the groom of the stool was such an intimate position that the office holder was automatically one of the most powerful men at court. He attended the king during his most private moments, had unrestricted access to the royal bedchamber, and was often the conduit through which petitions and messages reached the king. Sir Anthony Denny, who holds the position in 1546, uses it to exercise significant influence over the flow of information to and from the king, effectively gatekeeping Henry's attention during the vulnerable hours of the early morning and late evening. The fact that this political power derives from an office originally created to assist the king in the lavatory is one of those details about Tudor England that seems too absurd to be true and is, in fact, entirely accurate. The evening after dinner is when the court's other entertainments begin. There may be music in the presence chamber, where the king's musicians perform for a small, invited audience. There may be dancing, though by 1546 Henry can no longer participate and watches from his chair, with an expression that courtiers interpret variously as nostalgic, bitter, or simply pained. There may be gambling. Card games and dice games are enormously popular at court, and Henry himself is a notorious gambler who wagers large sums on cards, backgammon, and sporting events. There may be a masque, one of those elaborate theatrical performances combining music, dance, and allegorical storytelling that are a signature feature of Tudor court entertainment, though by this late stage of the reign the masques are less frequent and less ambitious than in the glory days of Henry's youth. Or there may be nothing. There may simply be the slow, quiet winding down of a long day in a long year in a long reign. Servants bank the fires and carry away the dishes. The dogs settle into their customary spots on the rushes. The yeomen of the guard make their final rounds, checking doors, securing windows, and searching the cellars one last time before the palace settles into its nighttime configuration. The candles are extinguished one by one, moving outward from the king's apartments to the periphery, until only the night lights remain, single candles burning in corridors and stairwells, casting just enough light to prevent a person from walking into a wall, which in a palace of 1,500 rooms and no electric lighting is not a trivial concern. Historians still argue whether Tudor courtiers genuinely enjoyed the evening entertainments, or whether they participated out of obligation, unable to refuse an invitation from the king without risking his displeasure, and unable to leave early without being noticed. The surviving letters and diaries suggest a range of reactions, from genuine pleasure to exhausted performance, and the truth is probably that court entertainment, like everything else at Henry's court, was simultaneously enjoyable and oppressive, voluntary and compulsory, a privilege and a burden. As you lie on your pallet in your small dark chamber, listening to your roommate's breathing settle into the steady rhythm of sleep, your mind drifts to the people who are no longer at court, the ghosts who haunt the empty seats at the table. Because in 1546 the absences are as eloquent as the presences, and anyone who has been at court for more than a few years carries a mental catalogue of the people who used to be here and are not anymore, and the reasons they vanished. Start with the queens. 3 of Henry's 6 wives have been removed from the table by violence or decree. Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, was divorced and banished from court in 1531, and she died in exile in 1536, possibly of cancer, possibly, as she herself believed, of a broken heart. Anne Boleyn. His second wife was arrested, tried and beheaded in 1536 on charges of adultery, incest and treason that most modern historians believe were fabricated. Jane Seymour, his third wife, died of complications following the birth of Prince Edward in 1537, not executed but consumed by the biological cost of providing the heir that Henry so desperately wanted. Anne of Cleves. His fourth wife was divorced after 6 months in a marriage that Henry found physically repulsive, and she survives in comfortable retirement, the smartest of the lot, having negotiated a generous settlement and the good sense to stay far from court and further from the king's bed. Catherine Howard, his fifth wife, was executed in 1542 at the age of roughly 17, beheaded on Tower Green for adultery. This time the charges were probably true, though the severity of the punishment was entirely disproportionate. And now Catherine Parr, the sixth and final wife, sits at the Queen's table knowing the full history of her predecessors and calculating, with every word she speaks, how to avoid joining the 3 who are in their graves. The Queen's are the most famous absences, but they are not the only ones. Thomas More, the Lord Chancellor, executed in 1535 for refusing to accept Henry's supremacy over the Church. John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, remember him? The man whose cook, Richard Roos, started our story tonight. Fisher was also executed in 1535, beheaded on Tower Hill, a frail old man in his 70s who was made a cardinal, by the Pope and a corpse by the King in the same year. Thomas Cromwell, the brilliant, ruthless minister who engineered the dissolution of the monasteries and the break with Rome, executed in 1540 on charges of treason and heresy that were almost certainly motivated by political rivalry rather than genuine evidence. Anne Askew, burned alive at Smithfield in July of this very year, 1546, carried to the stake in a chair because the rack had broken her body, but not her convictions. These are the names you know, but there are dozens of others, minor courtiers, household servants, monks, priests, and ordinary people who fell afoul of the kings, laws or the king's displeasure or the shifting definitions of orthodoxy, and found themselves in the Tower, on the scaffold, or in exile. A historical fact. Henry VIII executed approximately 57,000 people during his reign, though the precise number is debated and many of those were common criminals rather than political victims. Even a more conservative count of political executions runs into the hundreds, and each one sent a ripple of fear through the court that lingered long after the blood was cleaned from the scaffold. You think about this as you lie in the darkness, and you think about the meal you have just eaten, the warmth of the bread, the richness of the beef, the comfortable weight of ale in your belly, and you realize that the warmth and the terror are not separate experiences. They are the same experience. The feast and the scaffold are both expressions of the same power, the same man, the same system that can fill your stomach with venison and empty your neck of its head with equal ease and equal ceremony. The table at which you ate tonight was set by servants whose predecessors served people who are now dead, and the silverware you used may well have been held by hands that were later severed from their wrists. This is not metaphor. This is the literal reality of life at Henry's court in 1546. The food is real, the danger is real, and the distance between them is measured, in nothing more substantial than the king's mood. A quirky detail that captures this duality. The Tower of London, where political prisoners were held, tortured, and executed, maintained its own kitchen and its own dining service for prisoners of high rank. Imprisoned nobles and bishops were fed meals that, while not comparable to the royal table, were substantially better than what the average English citizen ate. A condemned man might dine on roasted meat, fresh bread, and wine the night before his execution. The system that killed you also fed you right up until the moment it did not, and there was something almost polite about it, a grim courtesy that said, "We are going to take your life in the morning, but in the meantime, would you care for some mutton?" Historians still argue whether the culture of political violence at Henry's court was a rational system of control, an effective deterrent that maintained order by making the consequences of disloyalty vividly, publicly, spectacularly clear, or a product of Henry's increasingly unstable personality, a cycle of paranoia and punishment that fed on itself and produced more fear than it resolved. The truth, as with everything else in this story, is probably a tangled knot of both, and untangling it with the tools of modern psychology is as difficult as untangling the motives of a man who's been dead for nearly 500 years. What we can say is that in 1546, fear is the primary seasoning at every meal, and the people who sit at Henry's table taste it in every bite, no matter how much saffron the cooks add to the sauce. The meals we have been describing are the everyday affairs, the daily 10 o'clock dinner and 4 o'clock supper that sustain the household through the working routine of the court. But the Tudor year is punctuated by feast days that elevate the dining experience to something approaching the transcendent, and it is worth understanding what happens when the court truly celebrates. Because the difference between an ordinary meal and a feast day banquet is the difference between a candle and a bonfire. The sacred calendar provides the structure. Christmas is the most important celebration, lasting 12 days from December 25th to January 6th, 12th night. During this period, the court transforms. The Great Hall is decorated with greenery, holly, ivy, rosemary, and bay, and the household enters a sustained period of feasting, entertainment, and excess that would make a modern office Christmas party look like a Quaker meeting. The food during Christmas is spectacular, even by Tudor standards. The great pies grow larger and more elaborate. The subtleties become more ambitious. Whole boars' heads are carried in on silver platters, garnished with rosemary and gilded apples. The peacock makes its fire-breathing entrance. The marchpane castles and sugar ships achieve their most extravagant forms, and the 12 days are filled with masques, plays, music, dancing and games presided over by the Lord of Misrule, a temporary master of ceremonies whose job is to organise the entertainment and ensure that everyone has a sufficiently good time. Under penalty of the king's displeasure, Easter is the second great feast, preceded by the 40 days of Lent, during which meat is forbidden and the kitchen shifts entirely to fish. The austerity of Lent makes the Easter feast feel like an explosion of flavour. The return of roasted meats, the richness of butter and cream after weeks of abstinence, the sheer relief of a table unbound by restriction. The contrast is deliberate. The Church designed the Lenten fast specifically to make Easter more vivid, more celebratory, more meaningful, and in a culture where food is both a daily necessity and a primary form of entertainment, the rhythm of fasting and feasting gives shape to the entire year. Other feast days include Midsummer, Michaelmas, All Saints' Day, and the various saints' days that the church calendar recognises. Each brings its own particular culinary traditions. Michaelmas goose. A goose roasted for the feast of St. Michael on September 29th is one of the most enduring. Twelfth Night cake, a rich spiced cake with a bean hidden inside it, the finder of which is declared king of the bean and given temporary authority over the evening's entertainment, is another. These traditions connect the court to the wider community, because the same feasts are celebrated throughout England, albeit on a vastly smaller scale, and the seasonal rhythm of the table creates a shared cultural experience that bridges, however temporarily, the gap between the palace and the village. A historical fact about Tudor feast day entertainment: the Christmas celebrations of 1546 are among the last Henry will preside over, and surviving accounts suggest they are subdued compared to the spectacular entertainments of his earlier reign. The king is too ill to participate actively. The factional tensions at court, Gardiner's conservatives versus Seymour's reformers, make genuine celebration difficult because every toast, every mask, every choice of entertainment has political implications that the participants cannot ignore. It is a Christmas haunted by the knowledge that the king is dying and that the succession crisis is approaching, and the feasting has an edge of desperation to it, like a party thrown on the eve of a storm. A quirky detail about Twelfth Night: the Lord of Misrule was traditionally given license to behave outrageously, commanding courtiers to perform embarrassing tasks, reversing social hierarchies for a night, making fun of the established order. This was understood as a safety valve, a controlled release of social tension that, by briefly inverting the rules, actually reinforced them. But in 1546, with the king's temper as unpredictable as the English weather, and the political stakes as high as they have ever been, the Lord of Misrule treads carefully. There is license, and then there is a license to get yourself killed, and the Tudor court has a well-documented inability to distinguish between the two. The feast days also bring out the most elaborate tableware. The royal plate collection, gold and silver dishes, goblets, ewers and candelabra, is one of the great treasures of the English crown, and it is displayed during banquets on a side table called a cupboard, which is essentially a shelf unit designed to show off the best pieces to the assembled guests. The number of shelves on the cupboard is itself a status marker. More shelves mean higher rank, and the king's cupboard has the most shelves of all, laden with enough gold and silver to fill a small museum. The light catches these pieces and throws reflections across the room, shifting points of gold and silver light that move with the flickering candles and create a kind of visual music that accompanies the actual music from the gallery. It is beautiful. It is overwhelming, and it is, above all, expensive, because every piece of plate on that cupboard represents a quantity of precious metal that could have been spent on something practical, and the decision to spend it on tableware instead is Henry's way of saying, "I am so rich, so powerful, so far above ordinary concerns, that I can afford to turn money into dinner plates and display them on a shelf, while half of England worries about the price of bread." Historians still argue whether the elaborate feasting of the Tudor court was a necessary display of power, a form of soft diplomacy that impressed foreign visitors, rewarded loyal subjects, and reinforced the magnificence of the crown, or a reckless extravagance that drained the royal treasury and contributed to the financial difficulties of later reigns. Both arguments have merit, and Henry himself would probably not have understood the distinction, because for him the feast was the power, the table was the throne, and the food was the argument, served on golden plates and washed down with Gascon wine. Let us talk about something that the written sources can only hint at, something that no museum exhibit or historical recreation can truly convey: the smell. A Tudor banquet is an olfactory experience as much as a culinary one, and the layers of scent that fill the Great Hall during a meal create an atmosphere so dense, so complex, and so utterly unlike anything in the modern world that it deserves its own section. Close your eyes for a moment, breathe slowly, and imagine. The base layer is wood smoke. It is always there, in every room, at every hour, because the fires never stop. The kitchen fires produce a heavy, acrid smoke that seeps through corridors and drifts through doorways, carrying with it the fatty, meaty essence of whatever is roasting on the spits. The hall fireplaces produce a cleaner smoke from well-seasoned oak and ash, but even clean wood smoke has a persistent, penetrating quality that gets into your clothes, your hair, your skin, and never entirely leaves. After a week at court, you smell like a bonfire. After a month, you do not notice anymore. After a year, you have forgotten that the world can smell any other way. Over the wood, smoke lies the food. The roasting meat is the dominant note during meals, that rich, primal, slightly sweet smell of animal fat rendering in fierce heat. It triggers something deep and old in the human brain, something that predates courts and palaces and kings by 100,000 years, and the response is always the same. Hunger, anticipation, the unconscious salivation that tells your body something good is coming. Beneath the roast are the subtler aromas, the warm yeasty breath of fresh bread from the bakehouse, the sharp bite of the spices being ground in the spicery, the herby fragrance of the sauces being prepared in the little kitchen, where rosemary, thyme and parsley are chopped and scattered with generous hands. The ale adds its own contribution, a sour, yeasty smell that rises from every cup and jug and barrel, mingles with the food smells, and creates a distinctive bass note that is the olfactory signature of Tudor communal dining. The wine, when it appears at the upper tables, contributes something richer, the tannins and fruit of the Gascon claret, the honey sweetness of the Malmsey, the sherry warmth of the sack, and the hypocras, that spiced wine served at the end of the meal, fills the room with cinnamon and ginger and sugar and heat, a smell so warm and comforting that it seems designed by some benevolent force, specifically for the purpose of making people sleepy. But beneath the pleasant smells, and this is where modern sensibilities diverge most sharply from Tudor reality, there are the other smells. The rushes on the floor, absorbing spilled ale, dropped food, and the contributions of the dogs produce a musty organic undercurrent that ranges from mildly earthy to actively unpleasant, depending on how recently they were changed. The people themselves smell. 800 people in an era before regular bathing, before deodorant, before synthetic fabrics that wick moisture. The collective body odour of a Tudor court meal is something that would stop a modern person in their tracks. The courtiers attempt to mitigate this with perfume, sachets of dried herbs and flowers, and pomanders, perforated metal balls filled with aromatic substances that they hold to their noses when the ambient atmosphere becomes overwhelming. The pomander is not a fashion accessory. It is a survival tool. And then there is the king. We have already mentioned that Henry's ulcerated legs produce a smell detectable from 3 rooms away, and during a meal in the presence chamber, that smell mingles with the food, the smoke, the candle wax, the perfume, and the general human atmosphere to create something that the courtiers learn to ignore through sheer force of will. Nobody wrinkles their nose, nobody turns their head, nobody reaches for their pomander with anything that could be interpreted as a pointed gesture. The smell of the king's decay is, like the king's decay itself, a reality that everyone knows about and nobody acknowledges, a shared secret so large that it fills every room the king enters and, yet occupies no space in conversation. A quirky detail about Tudor scent management. The rushes on the floor were sometimes mixed with fragrant herbs, lavender, sweet woodruff, meadowsweet, specifically to combat the less pleasant smells that accumulated between changings. The practice was widespread enough that it had its own name, strewing, and there were professional herb strewers employed in great households whose job was to ensure that the floor coverings were as aromatic as possible. The royal strewing herbs were ordered in bulk, and the household accounts record payments for enormous quantities of lavender and rosemary, purchased specifically for the purpose of making the palace smell less like a palace and more like a garden. Historians still argue whether Tudor people perceived their environment as smelly, or whether their olfactory expectations were simply calibrated to a different baseline. The evidence suggests the latter. Contemporary complaints about bad smells tend to focus on specific, extraordinary stenches rather than the general ambient odour, which implies that what would overwhelm a modern nose was simply the background of daily life. Erasmus's complaint about the rushes mentioned earlier is notable precisely because it is unusual, a foreigner's reaction to something that the English themselves had ceased to notice. The lesson is a gentle one. Every era has its own normal, and the things that seem intolerable from the outside are merely the conditions of existence from within. The candles are burning very low now. The smoke drifts in thin blue ribbons toward the ceiling, and the smell of the palace at night, ash, tallow, old rushes, and the distant warmth of a kitchen that never completely sleeps, is settling over you like a familiar blanket, dense and heavy and strangely comforting. The smell of a world that is ending but does not know it yet. While you drift towards sleep, the palace does not sleep with you. The night shift begins as the day shift ends, and the servants who keep this enormous organism alive work through the hours of darkness with the quiet, practiced efficiency of people whose labour is designed to be invisible. The kitchen boys are banking the fires, not extinguishing them. The fires in the great kitchen are never fully put out, because relighting 6 enormous hearths from coal takes hours and would delay the morning meal, and they are sweeping the worst of the debris from the kitchen floors, clearing the work tables, and setting out the ingredients that the early morning bakers and cooks will need when they begin their shifts in a few hours. The scullions are at the washing. Hundreds of pots, pans, platters, and goblets need to be cleaned, and the cleaning is done by hand with sand, ash and hot water in a scullery that is only slightly less hot than the kitchen itself. The pewter and silver pieces are cleaned separately by servants of higher rank, because the precious metals require more careful handling, and because the temptation to pocket a silver spoon is real enough that supervision is constant. A missing spoon means an investigation. An investigation means interrogations. And interrogations in Henry's palace have a way of escalating beyond the original question. Because once the wheels of suspicion start turning, they have a momentum of their own, and a tendency to catch people who had nothing to do with the missing spoon but who, upon further inquiry, turn out to have said something unfortunate about the king's marriage, or the Pope's authority, or the price of wool in Flanders. The laundry is working too, because the tablecloths, napkins and serving cloths from the meal need to be washed, dried and pressed before the next meal, and the volume of linen that passes through the royal laundry is staggering. The laundresses, this is one of the areas where women are employed in the household, work with enormous wooden tubs of hot water, lye soap, and the brute strength required to wring out heavy wet linen by hand. It is back-breaking, joint-destroying work, and it is performed by women who occupy the very lowest rungs of the household hierarchy, paid less than the kitchen grooms, housed in the meanest quarters, and largely invisible to the courtiers whose spotless napkins they produce. A quirky detail. The laundresses were so physically demanding of their role that they developed a reputation for exceptional arm strength, and there are occasional references in Tudor household accounts to laundresses being borrowed for other tasks requiring heavy lifting, which suggests that the Tudor laundry was not merely a domestic operation, but a form of involuntary weight training. The night watchmen make their rounds, carrying lanterns through the darkened corridors, checking doors and listening for sounds that should not be there. The Palace of Whitehall is an enormous, sprawling complex with hundreds of rooms, dozens of entrances, and a perimeter that is essentially impossible to fully secure. The watchmen's rounds are as much about reassurance as actual security. Their presence, their lantern light moving through the corridors, is a signal that someone is watching, and the signal alone is a deterrent to the opportunistic thief, the drunk courtier trying to find his way to someone else's wife's chamber, and the occasional rat that has grown bold enough to venture into the inhabited parts of the palace. The rats are worth mentioning, because they are a constant, unacknowledged presence in every Tudor building, and the palace is no exception. They live in the walls, under the floors, in the cellars, and in the kitchen stores, and they consume a measurable percentage of the food supplies despite the efforts of the palace cat population and the occasional organised rat hunt. The kitchen sergeants wage a perpetual, largely futile war against the rats, setting traps, blocking holes, and keeping the most valuable stores, spices, sugar, fine flour, in sealed containers or elevated cupboards. But the rats are resilient, adaptable, and far more numerous than the cats, and the medieval English rat, a creature with centuries of experience in cohabiting with humans, treats every attempt at eradication as a minor inconvenience rather than a serious threat. A historical fact about the nighttime palace. Fire is the great fear. A palace lit by thousands of candles and heated by dozens of fireplaces, with floors covered in dried rushes and walls hung with fabric tapestries, is a fire trap of extraordinary efficiency. The watchmen carry water buckets on their rounds. Fire hooks, long poles with iron hooks at the end, used to pull burning thatch from roofs, are stored at strategic points throughout the palace, and the household regulations include detailed instructions for the handling of candles, the banking of fires, and the behaviour of servants around open flames, all of which suggest that the threat of fire is taken very seriously indeed. Hampton Court Palace suffered a devastating fire in 1486, decades before Henry acquired it, and the memory of that fire influenced the design of the rebuilt palace, with the kitchens deliberately separated from the main buildings by fire breaks and courtyards. Henry's private apartments are located as far from the kitchens as architecture allows, because the man who fears poison also fears fire, and the palace is designed to protect him from both. As the night deepens, the palace settles into its quietest state, though it is never truly silent. There is always the creak of timber settling in the cold, the distant murmur of the river, the occasional bark of a dog in the outer courtyard, the muffled sound of servants' footsteps on stone. The palace breathes. It contracts slightly in the cold night air, its timbers shifting, its masonry groaning, and if you lie still in your chamber and listen closely, you can almost hear it, the vast, complicated organism of stone and wood and human labour that surrounds you, keeping you warm, keeping you fed, and keeping you, for now, alive. Historians still argue whether the servants of the Tudor household experienced their work as oppression or as opportunity. The hours were brutal, the conditions harsh, the pay modest, and the risks significant. But the alternative, life outside the palace, in a world of uncertain harvests, epidemic disease, and no social safety net, was worse. The palace servant ate regularly, slept under a roof, and had the chance, however slim, of advancement. The scullion might become a groom. The groom might become a yeoman. The yeoman might, in a lifetime of diligent, careful, politically astute service, rise to a position of genuine authority and modest comfort. The ladder was tall, and the rungs were slippery, but it was a ladder, and in Tudor England, any ladder was better than no ladder at all. You wake before dawn to the sound of activity below, the kitchen boys stoking the fires, the bakers already at work, the distant clatter of pots and the muffled shout of a sergeant organising his grooms. Your chamber is cold, the single candle has long since burned out, and the only light comes from the thin grey line of dawn visible around the edges of the shuttered window. You lie still for a moment, reluctant to leave the warmth of your pallet, and you think about the meal ahead. Another day at the royal table, another day of performance and observation, and careful, careful speech. But your thoughts keep drifting further forward, beyond today's dinner, beyond this week's feast, beyond the turning of the season, because everyone at court knows, even if nobody says it, that the world you're living in is ending. Henry is dying. The ulcerated legs, the morbid obesity, the gout, the dental abscesses, the increasing difficulty breathing, the swelling in his face and extremities, every symptom points toward a body that is shutting down, organ by organ, month by month. The physicians know, the Privy Council knows, the courtiers know, Catherine Parr knows, and Henry himself, somewhere beneath the layers of denial and defiance and sheer stubborn refusal to acknowledge his own mortality, probably knows too. When Henry dies, when, not if, the succession will pass to his son, Prince Edward, who is 9 years old. A child king means a regency, and a regency means a power struggle. And the power struggle is already underway, played out in the dining rooms and corridors and chapel of Whitehall, with the polite ferocity of men who understand that the stakes are not merely political, but existential. The Conservatives, led by Gardiner and Wriothesley, want to preserve the religious status quo that Henry has established, Catholic in doctrine, independent of Rome, hostile to further Protestant reform. The Reformers, led by Edward Seymour, the future Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector, and John Dudley, the future Duke of Northumberland, want to push England further toward Protestantism. Both factions understand that whoever controls the regency will control the direction of the country, and both are manoeuvring with quiet desperation to secure their position before the inevitable happens. A historical fact about this period: in the final months of 1546 and the early weeks of 1547, Henry makes a series of moves that suggest he's trying to shape the succession from his deathbed. He removes Gardiner from the Privy Council, which significantly weakens the conservative faction. He confirms the reformers in key positions of influence, and he signs a will that establishes a regency council balanced between the factions, though the reformers, Seymour, Dudley, Denny, hold the critical positions. Whether these moves represent Henry's genuine intentions or the manipulation of a dying man by the faction closest to his bedside, and Anthony Denny, the groom of the stool is very close indeed, is one of the great unanswered questions of Tudor history. Historians still argue whether Henry's will was truly his own, or whether Denny and the reformers, who controlled access to the king during his final weeks, effectively wrote it themselves, guiding the dying man's hand, literally, since Henry was too weak to sign and the document bears a stamped signature rather than a written one. The implications are enormous. If the will was manipulated, then the entire trajectory of the English Reformation, the further Protestant reforms under Edward VI, the Catholic reaction under Mary, and the final Protestant settlement under Elizabeth, was shaped not by the king's deathbed wishes but by the political manoeuvring of the men who sat closest to him at his final meals. The table, in the end, determines everything. Who sits at it? Who serves it? Who controls what reaches it? The food, the wine, the conversation, the silence. All of it is power, expressed in the most basic and most universal of human activities. And in 1546, at the table of a dying king, the power is shifting, tilting, sliding from one set of hands to another with the slow inevitability of sand running through an hourglass. You will eat breakfast this morning, manchet bread if you're lucky, with ale and perhaps a piece of cold meat from last night's supper, and you will take your place at the table, and you will do your best to navigate the currents that are pulling this court toward its reckoning. You will smile at the right people, you will avoid the wrong topics. You will eat what you are given, drink what is poured, and keep your thoughts behind your teeth, because in 1546, at Henry VIII's royal table, the most dangerous thing you can consume is not the food, it is not the wine, it is not even the poison that the tasters are checking for, with every bite and every sip. The most dangerous thing you can consume is an opinion, because opinions have a shelf life measured in months, and what is orthodoxy today is heresy tomorrow, and the only safe position is no position at all, which is itself a position, and is therefore not entirely safe. A quirky detail about the morning meal: breakfast was not a formal affair at the Tudor court. It was a private, quiet meal taken in your own chambers or in the buttery, consisting of bread, ale, and perhaps some cold leftovers. The elaborate ceremony of the court dinner was reserved for the midday and evening meals, and the morning was a rare period of relative informality when you could eat without an audience, speak without a witness, and think without a performance. Breakfast in the Tudor court was the closest thing to freedom, and the fact that even this small freedom was conducted behind closed doors tells you everything about the world you're living in. The palace is quiet now, truly quiet, in that deep, settled way that only comes in the very last hours before dawn, when even the kitchen has paused its restless activity and the night watchmen have completed their final round, and the fires have been banked to a low, steady glow that casts more warmth than light. You are in your chamber. Your breathing has slowed. The sounds of the palace have receded to a distant murmur, like the breathing of some enormous animal asleep in the darkness around you. Outside, London sleeps too. The Thames moves silently beneath the palace walls, carrying its cargo of moonlight and river fog toward the sea. The streets are empty. The market stalls are shuttered. Even the stray pigs have found their corners and settled in. The moon hangs low over the rooftops of Suffolk, painting the thatched roofs with a cold silver that will burn off when the sun rises. But for now, everything is still, and everything is silver, and everything is waiting. You think about the meal you ate tonight, the bread, the pottage, the beef, the ale, the sound of the trumpet announcing the first course, the procession of dishes carried through the torchlit hall, the music from the gallery, soft and slow and half-remembered, the taste of custard, sweet with sugar and warm with cinnamon. the weight of the day settling into your bones like sand into water grain by grain, until you cannot tell where wakefulness ends and sleep begins. You think about the people at the table, the gentleman who laughed too loudly at someone's joke, the lady who did not laugh at all, the bishop who ate with precise mechanical efficiency and spoke to no one, the young page who spilled a jug of ale and stood frozen in terror until someone quietly helped him clean it up, the king, somewhere above you in his private chambers, attended by servants who see everything and say nothing, lying on a bed too large for one man and too small for his pain, listening to the palace settle around him like a ship finding its anchorage for the night. Henry has 7 months to live. He does not know this. Or perhaps he does, in the way that a candle knows it is burning down, not with the mind, but with the body, which grows heavier and cooler and dimmer by degrees. In January of 1547, he will die at Whitehall Palace, in the small hours of the morning, attended by Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, who will hold his hand and ask him for a sign of faith, and Henry will squeeze his hand, and that will be the end. The end of the reign, the end of the table, the end of the roasted swan and the fire-breathing peacock and the marchpane castles and the 600 gallons of ale and the 55 rooms of kitchen and the 200 cooks and the 320 pounds of dying king. But that is January, and this is still the autumn, and the fires are still burning, and the bread is still baking, and somewhere in the cellar a rat is helping itself to the Gascon claret, and somewhere in the watching chamber a tapestry is stirring gently in a draught, and somewhere in the great hall a dog is dreaming, its paws twitching against the rushes. And you are dreaming too now, or close to it. Your thoughts have softened to the consistency of warm bread. Your body has given up its tension. The palace is a ship, and the ship is on a river, and the river is carrying you somewhere quiet and dark and warm, where there are no factions and no heresy and no treason, just the gentle rocking motion of the water and the distant sound of a lute playing a melody that might have been written by a king, or might have been written by a clever musician who knew better than to claim credit. Sleep now. Let the rushes be soft beneath you. Let the candle gutter and go out. Let the palace keep its watch around you, with its fires and its guards and its rats and its ghosts. Tomorrow the trumpet will sound again, and the table will be set again, and the whole extraordinary, terrifying, beautiful performance will begin again. But that is tomorrow. Tonight there is only this: the darkness, the quiet, the slow, steady rhythm of your own breathing, and somewhere, far away, the sound of bread baking.